Hello guys, welcome to Soul Fiction. So in this video, we will see, what if Naruto had the supreme shadow monarch powers? If you enjoy these kinds of stories, don't forget to show us some love by hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. Your support means the world to us. Now, let's start the story. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Opened the Black Gate. Dusk made the bridge look unfinished. Steel bones crowded by scaffolds, planks left raw and pale, cables moaning in the salt wind. Waves slapped the pillars and came back foaming, the sound like someone breathing too fast. Work crews had abandoned their carts and ropes and run for cover when the first volley of kunai stitched the central span. The men coming out of the fog wore mismatched armor and white-painted masks. Sun etchings glowed along their vambraces, harsh little suns that burned the shadows off the boards wherever they stepped. Mercenaries, Kakashi said, soft as sawdust. His visible eye didn't blink. The kind who bring lamps to a knife fight. Chizuna crouched behind him, smelling of fish and fear. Sasuke flattened on the far parapet, fire already breathing in the way his hands closed. Sakura kept the carpenter's kid pressed to the boards, her chakra a steady hand on a bleeding cut. The wind carried brine, old rope, something bitter. Hinata was a shadow of her own, kneeling at the bridge's rail. Byakugan veined and bright. They placed mirrors, she murmured. 6. No. 8. Threaded with seal lines. Lines to what? Naruto asked. She didn't look at him. Her gaze saw through timber. Through flesh. Each other. The mercenaries hit the span with the confidence of men who knew how their toys worked. The first struck a metal stud and clicked his wrist. The stud flared a clear, mean light. All along the boards, shadows snapped short, huddling directly under bodies like something ashamed. The bridge became naked. The covers you take for granted, angles, stray darkness, were gone. It was the weirdest feeling, being visible even behind something. Kakashi's shoulder brushed Naruto's. Priority is the cruise, he said, because he wanted Naruto thinking Abu. Chi saving and not about the dozen men loading tags into slings. Naruto took a breath that hurt and didn't say he'd already done the math. He could feel the rhythm of the enemy's footfalls like a drum that kept time for knives. He could feel how the wind funneled between the towers and came out cutting. He could feel the kid shaking against Sakura's hand. On me, Naruto said. Sometimes the voice that came out of him sounded older than he felt. People listened. Maybe because he meant it. Maybe because he didn't pretend he wasn't scared. He went low and fast, crossing the gap before the nearest merc could sweep his mirror toward them. Kunai pinged where he'd just been. Sasuke blew out a short, contemptuous gout of flame that forced two men to throw up their arms and backpedal into their own glare. Kakashi flickered and an attacker folded where his neck had been. Hinata's breath sharpened. Naruto. The fourth mirror, above. See it, he said, and meant, I see because you see. They made it to the first knot of terrified workers. Naruto shoved a cart sideways to make a thin wall, lifted two men by their belts, hauled them toward the opposite lane. His shoulder burned where a tag had spit. A bead of sunfire passed him for being too slow. He swallowed the pain and didn't look at it. Sakura, move your bundle, he shouted, and Sakura tried to move the little boy and his two wide eyes and teeth. He kid fought her and twisted and saw the man on the span raising something that looked like a mirror and Naruto didn't think. He shoved off with all that stubborn in him and cut across empty space. The man with the mirror smiled. The mirror flashed, a white light that was all that light wanted to be, and Naruto's feet went out from under him as a knife slid into the boards where his ankle had been. His balance went, then the rail, then the world. The last thing he saw was the boy's face, a small O of despair as Naruto fell. The last thing Naruto felt was the knife that nicked his ribs, hot and mean. The last thing he heard was his name. The river grabbed him, thick and cold as a hand with a mind. It slammed him into a pillar and he lost most of his breath, then dragged him under. Down there the light died quickly. The color leaving the world like paint lifted with solvent. The current tried to make him a secret. Naruto flailed once, twice, punched for surface, missed. His lungs burned in a language without words. He landed on something that wasn't a rock. It was a door. He knew because doors have a certain stubbornness. This one had handles like crossed kunai and a seam too fine to admit a hair. It didn't belong down here. It shouldn't have been this cold. But the cold was right, somehow, like a fever breaking. The world narrowed to two choices, quit or knock. Naruto reached. Fingers slipped on the metal. He set his teeth and tried again. The handles were heavy. He pulled and heard an old sound, a sound like someone moving furniture in a room far away. The seam opened half a breath. Twilight came through like a flood of ink poured in water. It wasn't dark. It was the color of breath on glass. The river's noise dulled. The cold slid up his arms and into his chest. He felt a heartbeat that wasn't his own. No. That was wrong. It was his, but multiplied, marching in step with other hearts he couldn't see. He breathed without breathing. Shadows lay under everything. Even underwater there were shades. Straight aware light tired and gave up. In those not quite places, something answered his pull with a kind of hello that made his eyes sting. He didn't ask what it was. He already had his question. Can you help me get back? The answer was a pressure in his bones, yes, spoken in a tongue made of pulse. Naruto kicked. He didn't rise. He didn't swim. He stepped through AP. Laced between places that had the shape of a shadow under a bridge in a winter afternoon. He stepped, and he was standing, wet and bleeding, in the kid's own small shade, between the boy and the man with the mirror. The man's mirror flashed. The light found Naruto and tried to make him a lie. Naruto grinned. Too many teeth. Hi, he said. That's a nice toy. He moved before the man could be shocky. D about a boy climbing out of a child's shadow. Naruto sank into the thin puddle of dark the man made between his feet and the board, felt the way the light pushed on it like a thumb, and went around the thumb. He came up on the man's left with his kunai already thrown. The kunai rang off bright metal. The merc's armor held where it had been carved with sun lines. The man's smile came back in a different shape, relief, maybe. Overconfident. He jerked his mirror in a sweeping arc to erase Naruto's stepping ground. And Naruto, who had spent his whole life running at things that told him not to, Einted into the light and then went down where light didn't look, the shadow inside the curve of a man's shoulder when he raised his arm to strike. He came out behind the man. He put his palm between armor plates along the spine and shoved. The merc stumbled and went to his knees. The mirror rattled across the deck. Naruto's hand closed around the man's collar. He leaned him forward until the glow carved under the armor exposed the man's heart. You can stop, Naruto said. Or I can make you stop. The man laughed. Horse. You can't make a son kneel. He lunged for a knife. Naruto put him down hard. Things happened fast around them. Sasuke's fire cornered too, drove them into Kakashi's hand like sheep driven to a dog. Hinata called numbers, that precise voice that never once said, please, to the facts. Sakura kept the kid alive. The remaining mercs fell back, tight formation around a stronger light. The mirror runners re-angled. The bridge turned sterilized bright. Naruto landed on one knee beside the mercenary captain and felt the world tilt. Blood soaked his shirt. His left side felt raw from sternum to hip. The man under his hand coughed out something dark and swallowed it poorly. His eyes, when they found Naruto's, weren't mean anymore, just human and small and surprised. A flicker, then, Naruto didn't know what else to call it. Not a soul, a moment, the memory that cut deepest. Under all the lies a man tells himself. It touched Naruto like a wet palm on his cheek and he was somewhere else for a heartbeat, looking at a girl with a braid too tight and a bruise-shaped lick. Neighbors ring and putting a stolen coin into her hand and saying, run, Mari, run, and hearing boots at the door. The memory went. A body remained. Naruto could leave him down. He could let the light take him. He could kill him and feel nothing useful. He could also pull on the new tether in his chest and see what happened. His hand shook once, from pain. He pressed it flat on rough armor. And pulled the way he had pulled the gate. Shadow rose. Not smoke. Not fog. It climbed out from under the captain like a soldier rising out of a trench. It had his height and the way his shoulders knew weight. It had no face. Just a suggestion of features where somebody might have been. It knelt. The air around Naruto went very quiet. The captain's eyes went wide. He tried to spit. He didn't have the spit left. What? Echo. Naruto said, because the word fit. He felt the new thing waiting for him to say what it was. You fought for the wrong side, but you knew how to hold a line. If you want to keep doing it, we'll do it better. He didn't say please. He tilted his hand. The shade inclined its head. Kakashi arrived and did what Kakashi always did, saw 10 things in 1 second and banked the rest for later. His eye took in the shadow kneeling. His mouth made a small line. Naruto, he said, very mild. How long have you had the capability to recruit? About 10 seconds, Naruto said. He swayed and grinned because that was easier than falling. Can we argue after we don't die? Kakashi's nod was microscopic. It meant, later, yes. And, fine, show me. Naruto stood. Blood ran down his side into his boot. He lifted his chin anyway and let the wordless thing in his chest out a little. It wasn't chakra, not exactly. It wasn't loud, either. It was clarity. It ran through his voice and made it contagious. On me, he said again, and this time it traveled down the bridge like a bell struck. The workers looked up as if they could see a way out. Sasuke shifted his stance for a better angle without being told. Sakura got the kid to his feet. Hinata's breath steadied on the end of the line as if she'd been waiting for someone to choose. The mercenary formation tightened. Their lights stabbed. A man near the front threw a disc into the air. It hung and glowed like a small artificial sun and the boards went thready with the lack of shadow. Fourth mirror's anchor is behind the scaffold wheel, Hinata said, calm, hard. Naruto's new soldier. The echo he was already calling Glaive in his head because his presence felt like a polearm put into the ground, moved to his side without a sound. Naruto pointed with 2 fingers. Nothing dramatic. Break that line. Glaive stepped into the crack between the light disc and the board and shoved his arm where the disc's support had a shadow because even suns have seams. The arm went dim and not there and then he was simply somewhere else, a blur through the thin dark under the wheel, and the wheel went with a bad noise and pitched. The error at the end of the tether skated on its mount and showed the sun itself for a dangerous angle. The beam flared and miscut and took a chunk of board from under its own feet. Men yelped and rebalanced staggered their line. Now, Sasuke snapped, because they'd known each other long enough for one syllable to be a handshake. He spat fire. Kakashi was lightning and uglier than anyone had a right to be with only one eye on duty. Naruto stepped into shadow as if it were a path only he could see and came up where he needed to be. Hinata's calls were the skeleton for the whole thing, each number a bone you could lean weight on. A warden, rank marked by a brighter brand along the jaw, broke toward Sakura and the kid. Naruto beat him there by the distance of a half heartbeat. He tried to step through the warden's shadow and found it slick with light as if oiled. He bared his teeth, tried not to think, fainted left, and in the instant the man's foot lifted and cast a thin, guilty darkness under the sole. Naruto went through. He left half a second of frost where he'd been and came back with his fist. The warden went down hard. Naruto went with him, both hands on the brand and towed the man's knife away. The brand spat hot. It tried to chew his palm. He ignored it. Don't get up, he said, and put his knee on the man's bicep and felt a flash of the same wrongness he'd felt under the river. The sense of a law enforced by something that hadn't asked anybody for permission to rule. He didn't pull the echo there. The man was very much alive and very much in the way and that was enough. He looked up and the kid, Inari. His mind supplied, because Tazuna had said it 10 times, proud and tired, stared at him like he'd just seen a magic trick and also someone pick up a stone and put it somewhere sensible. Run to Sakura, Naruto told him. Don't look at anything bright. Just her. The kid ran. He didn't look back. They pushed the mercenaries to the far third of the span. Hinata's voice never lifted. 2 more mirrors. One on the crane, one in the hoist housing. The hoist has a maintenance crawlspace. Got eyes on the crawlspace? Naruto asked. Not unless I make a new one. Can you? She didn't answer. Her shoulders set like someone taking a breath to dive. She moved along the rail with that weird Hyuga grace, knees hardly bending, hand measuring the bolts as she passed. She set her palm flat and slid a foot over the seam. Now, she said, and kicked. The housing gave with a shriek. A man inside gaped at her hand appearing where a wall had not been a moment ago. She didn't wait. She drove 2 fingers into his shoulder and clicked 3 things nobody outside her clan knew the names for. He folded, neat and surprised. Thank you, Naruto said, and meant, for trusting yourself enough to break something. You're bleeding, she said, somewhere between warning and embarrassment. Later, he said, I'm busy being impressive right now. Her mouth twitched. You're doing fine. They took the crane mirror with a trick Naruto invented as his feet moved. He threw 3 shuriken, not at the mirror, but to wedge into the slots between deck boards just so. Their blades cast thin slivers of shade even in that punishing light. He stepped into one, then the next, then the last. The world became a strobe of here and gone, and came up on the crane arm with his hands already moving to cut the seal lines. The mirror choked on its own light and died. The mercenaries lost the rhythm. When you fight with toys, losing one breaks the song. Men glanced at each other. One bolted and got a spine full of Sasuke's contempt, which burned like summer. Kakashi breathed once, slow, and 3 went down with their hands still moving. Glaive was a constant on Naruto's left, a shape that watched angles and turned knives into bad ideas. The mercenary captain lay propped on one elbow, watching Naruto with a face that was trying to decide whether to hate him more for killing him or for not doing it sooner. What are you? He asked, and the word didn't have a question mark, it had a bruise. Busy, Naruto said, and ducked as a beam carved a groove where the top of his head had been. He rolled to one knee and flung a tag. It stuck to a beam with a little wet sound and threw smoke that billowed ugly. Tamari would have made a cleaner wall with a flick of her fan, but she wasn't here. He made do. He always made do. The last of the mirror runners tried to pull a bright flare and got a kunai in his wrist for the trouble. The disc clipped along the rail, skittered, and went over, sizzling like meat. Clear, Hinata said, and the word went through him like water after a long run. Silence came reluctantly. It came in between the cries of men who would live, and the open mouths of men who wouldn't. And the distant sound of someone dropping a wrench. It smelled like blood and salt and sun-burnt wood. Naruto stood there in that stubborn silence and waited to see what would shake out of it. Anbu, incoming, Kakashi said, which explained the sudden cold on the wind. She appeared without theatrics, just walking out of a seam in the fog like a woman who had always been there in Ha. D finally decided you had earned the right to notice. Her mask was a cat's. Her hair was purple and cut clean. She moved like every line had been drawn with a ruler. Her gaze went to the shade at Naruto's shoulder and stayed there a half-second longer than polite. Azuki, Kakashi said, a dry hello. Hataki. Her voice could have been a blade left in the snow for an hour. She tipped her head toward Naruto as if acknowledging a student who had thrown the correct knife at the correct time. You were the anomaly. Naruto sighed. Just. Naruto is fine. Anomaly is, like, an after-work name. He expected the mask to make humor useless. It didn't. Something eased around her shoulders. Noted, she said. Naruto. He didn't want to explain anything. He was so tired of explaining. He was also bleeding on the boards and Hinata had been staring at that spot on his ribs like it was the only thing left in the world. He looked at her and she looked away, which was her way of not pushing. He made the decision for her. Hinata, he said, and sat down because his legs had decided they were done. Please. She knelt beside him, her fingers gentle at first, then firm when he didn't flinch away. The oot was ugly and the brand had left a glitter under the skin that would eat through muscle if it liked the texture. Hold still, she murmured. He did. He watched her profile. He watched how her lips ughed between her teeth when the chakra had to dig for a stubborn shard. He watched the guilt on her face when she found it and the guilt when she lit it up and burned it out of him. He reached and put his hand on the cold rail so he wouldn't do something stupid like put it on her wrist. You're not allowed to take knives for small children every day, she said. It came out flat, like someone making a grocery list. Because if she gave it heat it would shake. Okay, he said, obedient because obedience is easy when it's earned. He tried a smile. It came out weak. We've got other sizes of children, anyway. Her mouth curved despite herself. I suppose. You do the seeing, he said. I do the stepping. It works. It works, she agreed, with a small shock in the middle of her voice, like saying it made it true in a new way. She pressed her palm to his ribs a final time, and the burn eased, and the world came back into color. Report, Azuki said, straightening from a conversation with Kakashi. She looked at the bodies and the burned mirrors and the workers huddled around torn ropes like men around a bonfire. Light-etched equipment as tribunal make. You were targeted. Feels like it, Naruto said. He did not look at the shadow at his shoulder because he did not want to watch anyone in a cat mask look at it the way people look at knives with names. He pushed to his feet. The whirl. D swayed once and then steadied because Hinata was a hand at his arm and she did not remove it until he was steady without it. They should have left it there, with the bridge breathing again and Menel owing the high-relief laughter of people who didn't want to think about what almost happened to them. But the world had been busy in the background this whole time. It had been making choices without waiting for permission. They went back to town while the crews argued about overtime and whether the sun discs would wash up or keep going downriver until they burned out. The streets smelled like oil and fried batter and rain coming. The little forge near the river mouth had its doors propped open to let the heat out and 2 fans hung from chains, clicking as they cut the air. A girl with dark hair pulled back and a bandana smudged with black leaned against a barrel and frowned at a spearhead as if it had broken a promise. Brittle, she said to no one, and then noticed Naruto and the rest of the world. Her eyes were bright, interested in the way a problem is. You going to stand there and bleed or come inside and drip on a floor I can sweep? Tenten. He'd seen her around the training fields, knew her throws, respected the way she never wasted motion. Naruto followed her in because the heat felt like a kind of kindness and because he needed to stand in a place where light made different shapes. Racks of tools crowded the back wall. A length of chain cooled on an anvil, its last link still dimly red. What are you making mad at you? Naruto asked. This, she said, flipping the spearhead over in tongs. Iron's fine. Carbon's wrong. The mix is there, but it has. She searched for the word. No forgiveness. She glanced at the slight hitch in his reach where Hinata's bandage pulled. You look like you could use some. Quote, I've got some, he said. Not enough. The thing in his chest that answered to twilight hummed at the back of his throat. He didn't know why he thought of it as an answer and not a thing. He lifted his hand. Hold out your tongs. Tenten did, the way a person does when curiosity outweighs everything else. He focused on the space in her tongs. He thought, oh, F the corner under an anvil where light didn't care what shape the world was. He pulled as if on a door that would always give if you asked with your whole weight. A bead of something like and not like any metal he knew condensed out of the shadow and sat in the tongs like a drop of night that had decided to be solid. Tenten swore in a craftsman's way, half reverent, half suspicious. What is that? A bad idea, Naruto said. Do you want to hit it? She grinned like a girl being told she could run in the hall. More than anything, she put it on the anvil and brought the hammer down. The bead sang. It flattened a little, then sprang back, then flowed like it remembered how to be something else. She pursed her mouth. Huh. Her eyes flicked to Naruto. Again. Hit it like you mean it, Naruto said. She did. The thing took the hit and turned it into shape the way a story takes a blow and refuses to be the same afterwards. Tenten's breath came faster, bold with ideas. I could make you something with this, she said, nose wrinkling as if that were a dare to herself. Make you something with this, he corrected, and meant it. He didn't want a crown. He wanted a mirror th. It showed him exactly who he was when it mattered. I just pulled it. You can teach it to be useful. She held the half-formed sliver to the light and the light slid off it like it was shy. You're weird, she said again, but warmer. Come back when you're not about to fall over. Understood, he said, and left her to stare at that sliver like it might tell her a better story if she listened long enough. Night put a thumb over the mouth of the river and pressed. Lamps flicked alive in windows. Naruto turned his face up to the sky because he'd always liked the part of day when you could still see both the shape of the world and where it would go when the dark came. It made him feel like a promise had been made to quiet and someone might keep it. Hinata walked beside him without talking. He liked that. Sakura had taken the kid home. Sasuke had smirked himself toward training, which was Sasuke for caring. Kakashi had vanished like a rumor you weren't supposed to repeat. Azuki had taken a perch somewhere Naruto's eyes couldn't quite hold on to. They crossed the square where fishmongers in dark aprons were shutting their stalls and cannery workers trudged with their lunches uneaten. A priest had set up a small shrine along the wall with a mirror and a handful of white paper gohei. It should have been a soft corner of night. It wasn't. The priest bent and picked up a shard of mirror, or glass with the thoughtful care of a reader turning a page. The shard still glowed along one broken edge. He held it to his own brand. A neat circle burned into his wrist under a stack of prayer beads, and the light crawled up his veins. Polite and intent, Naruto stopped walking. Hinata did too. The man didn't look up, but he smiled, and in that smile there was something like pity. They said a door opened, he said to the broken glass. They said a boy pulled it wide enough to breathe. He turned the shard. The light caught Naruto and tried to name him wrong. It didn't stick. The priest finally looked at him. His eyes were old and tired in the way a candle is old and tired after too much prayer. The air will be pleased, he said. Another man would have turned and run and pretended there hadn't been a conversation with a sentence like that perched on it. Naruto did the other thing. He met the priest's eyes and said, he can send a letter like everyone else. The priest laughed softly, the way a man laughs at a child's audacity and at his own for having underestimated it. He slipped the shard into his sleeve. You are not the first boy to think you can make a god speak to you like a man. Maybe not, Naruto said. But I'll be the last boy to make that mistake. The priest's gaze flicked to Hinata, and for a heartbeat Naruto's body went cold in a way no river could touch. He moved without thinking. Half a step. A shadow slipped under the priest's foot, a hand gentle on Hinata's back to edge her behind him as if she needed it. She didn't. He did it anyway. Sleep, little son, the priest whispered, and tapped the beads against his wrist. The light in the shrine mirror flared and went out. The square felt too big and too empty. The priest didn't vanish. He simply wasn't there between one breath and the next. Like someone had edited the street and forgotten to leave a smudge. Naruto looked up at the sky. The stars were the same as they'd been when he was 9 and Thog. He could eat them if he ran fast enough to the end of the field. Tonight they seemed closer, sharp enough to cut. Maybe that was him. Maybe that was the way light looked now, after you had used it to find the edges of the dark. Hinata touched his shoulder as if to ask a question without words. He answered the same way, just a small nod, just enough weight in it to say, I'm here. I'm me, for now. Come on, he said. Let's tell Kakashi we didn't start a war. They turned toward the narrow street where the safe house lived, with its ugly curtains and its too thin walls. The tide had risen. The bridge sang to itself in the distance. The metal settling deeper into its anchors for the night. Somewhere behind them, in a shrine that wasn't there anymore, a priest lit a second mirror and breathed on it until it showed him a face not present in any square. High above the water, above the bridge, above the town where oil smeared the docks like tears, something turned its attention toward them. You couldn't see attention. You could only feel the heat on your cheek when you stepped near it. Naruto kept walking. He didn't look up again. He thought of a door under a river and how it had opened. Because he had put his hands on it with everything he had. He would do that again. He suspected he would have too. Chapter 1 End. Chapter 2. The exams rewritten in twilight and wind. Registration smelled like floor wax and anxious sweat. Somebody had tried to make the academy lobby look ceremonial with banners and polished brass, but the line of genin wrapped twice around the hull and nobody felt ceremonial. A proctor clicked a pen like a metronome that measured nerves. A glass case held a model of the village in miniature. Tiny roofs, carefully painted trees, a dollhouse Hokage monument staring down with carved patience. Naruto watched the case because something about the way it caught light was wrong. You don't live your life being told to look closer without learning how to see the seams. The glass had hairline etchings along the bottom corners, dull to any normal eye, but when somebody walked past, the scratches brightened for a heartbeat as if they'd taken a bite of light and liked the taste. He tilted his head. Hinata. She stood just to his left, a masterclass in being present without demanding it. She didn't look at him, because looking gives away that you care. Her eyes had that pale, soft fire. I see them, she murmured. 2 extra feeds tied into the ceiling lanterns. They braided them into the window frames. Why? Sakura asked, going up on her toes to peer as if she could catch light by surprise. Because they're making a map, Naruto said, of how shadows move in here. Sasuke snorted. Who cares? You will, Naruto said, but lightly, not picking a fight. He Ened on the case and pretended to read the plaque about Konoha's founding while his fingers worked at the edge of a banner. The banner slipped. He let it fall crooked so it cast a new angle of shade. The hairline glow along the glass dulled as if disappointed. Naruto smiled without showing teeth and peeled a thin corner of black cloth from the banner's back. He rolled it between thumb and forefinger, pinched it into a slender strip. Sakura arched a brow. You planning to redecorate? I'm planning to make a corridor, he said. Hinata, count for me. She did, very softly. 3, 2, now. He flicked the strip and the little piece of cloth slapped and stuck to the glossy floor where a table leg made a triangle of shadow. He threw 3 more. Each landed with a tiny thwip and made a dotted line of false shade you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. The glow under the glass tried to root around the new line and failed for a second. Naruto stepped into the dots like a kid pretending to walk only on the dark tiles. Stop pacing, a proctor called, not looking up. Standing still very aggressively, Naruto called back. Hinata made a sound like a laugh she hadn't meant to let anyone hear. The sound made the room feel like you could breathe again. Sasuke folded his arms and watched the ceiling lanterns the way you watch a dare. If somebody's watching our shadows, they'll know what you're doing. Good, Naruto said. Sometimes you want them to know your bait is bait. A few people in line turned to look at the commotion and then turned back because there was always commotion. Where Naruto was and today they had other things to be afraid of. Proctors stamped papers. Shikamaru yawned like the world had personally offended him with the concept of effort. Ino braided and unbraided a piece of hair. Kiba's dog sneezed. The ordinary noises cushioned the edge of something sharper. The ceiling humming wasn't the hum of ordinary lamps. It had a purity to it, the note of an instrument tuned for harm. Naruto felt the gait in his chest notice, the way a soldier notices when somebody else wears boots with the wrong weight. Yugao materialized at his shoulder with a subtle that made you forgive ghosts for scaring you. She wore no uniform marker beyond the way stillness liked to sit near her. You were being measured, she said, conversational, as if remarking on the weather. Me too, Naruto said. She followed his eyes to the glass case. Her head tilted a fraction, a mental click. Which is why you are throwing garbage on the floor. Art, he said. Experimental. Neat lines, she said. Who told you to count? Nobody, he said, and let the answer sit between them like a blade on a bench, needing a hand to be anything. Her attention warmed a degree. She laid 2 fingers on a wall-mounted sconce and turned them. It clicked with the smallest sound. The glow in the glass-etched lines flickered. The hum above them lost its absolute pitch. She let go, satisfied. If someone cuts light to rob you of ground, steal their light first. Is that a lesson? Naruto asked. It is clarification, she said. Command is not volume. It is the right sentence, at the right moment, once. She let her eyes drift down to his ribs where a bandage hid under his jacket. Once is kinder. He opened his mouth to say he'd try not to get stabbed again and shut it because Hinata had ALR. Edie said that for him last night and said it better. He nodded, something small and meant. Proctors funneled teams into rooms where Genjutsu tried to lie about which room was which. Shouted numbers bounced like thrown stones. Shino's insects made a sound like rain on a tin roof. Enko Mitarashi stalked across a desk, literally across it, with her coat swinging and her grin to make children misbehave. Forest of Death, she announced, dragging out the title until it sounded too pleased with itself. Papers signed. Scars optional. Humiliation likely. A murmur rolled through the crowd. Naruto ca. Ught Hinata's eye and then Tenten's across the room where she dug elbows into Neji's and Lee's ribs with friendly malice. He tipped his chin at her like a promise he'd come see the bead in her forge again. She arched a brow. Fix your holes first. They entered the forest through gates that had been tied open with old rope. The hot green smell was a punch of memory, sapinrot and old rain dreaming in the dirt. The rules were simple. Get the right scrolls. Survive. Trust that the exam's false dangers hid a more real one. Naruto didn't trust anything organized to be simple. He had learned the hard way that people who say, just, are about to make you smaller. A dragonfly stitched the air near his ear. He took 3 steps and tasted a sweetness that wasn't plant. Hold, he said softly, and they held, Sakura by reflex. Sasuke because he liked it when Naruto said things that felt like chess, Hinata because her Byakugan had just lit like a city under snow. What do you see? He asked. Wires, she said, not physical. Lines of intent. The forest is bright where it should be dim. It's wrong. Not like genjutsu, but like, polished. He rolled his shoulders, felt the gate hum back. Heliotropes, he said. Mirrors bent into flowers. He pointed without moving his hand from his side. They set one there, sucking shade, blooming under the leaves. Sasuke lifted his chin like he could glare the sun into blushing. Tear it down. Then, carefully, Naruto said, because this was how you kept people alive who thought they didn't need it. They're rigged to flash when they break. Hinata. Shadow roots. She took in a breath measured in inches of bark and angles of light. If you throw strips, there. She tapped his forearm twice with 2 fingers, silent punctuation. 3 steps only. Naruto unrolled the last scraps of black cloth he'd torn from the registrar's banner and thought of Tenten's hammer striking the bead until it sang. He threw the strips in quick succession, EY's following the way shadow widened a fraction where they fell. The micro shades gave him a path. He stepped across them as if bouncing stones. On the last step he went down and in, Aben step hugging the wedge under a fern. And came up with his hand already on the heliotrope stem. It pulsed hot. Light crawled along his fingers, mean and personal. He shoved it sideways into the ground where the dirt always has room for one more secret. The flower went out. The forest exhaled. 3 more and they had a corridor. The change was so subtle anyone else would have missed it. The shade under the Lao Rel grew a little like it had been allowed to sleep. The air cooled a degree. Sakura wiped sweat off her neck and didn't know why it helped. That was fine. Naruto didn't need everyone to know his tricks. He needed them to work. A rustle to their right became a team in less time than it takes to unsheathe a kunai. Kiba first. Grinning like these were the kinds of problems he liked. Akamaru cocked like a question mark on his head. Shino. Silent in a way that wasn't emptiness but green patience. Hinata glanced, measured, nodded. They were not meant to be in one group. They fell together anyway because the forest had been wired by people who weren't the proctors. Smells like lamp oil, Kiba said, nose wrinkling. Old, expensive. Sasuke tilted his head, listening to the trees. We're being shepherded. Not today, Naruto said. Hinata, your team's route. Kiba snorted. A Hyuga asking permission before she moves. That's a first. Hinata didn't look at him. Naruto needs my eyes. Keep them, Naruto said, as if she'd asked. And Kiba shut his mouth because something in the way Naruto said it swallowed up the sarcasm and turned it into choice. He didn't have to like it. He accepted it. They moved as 2 teams with one spine. When they hit a clearing where the dirt had been scuffed to hide trip runes, Naruto had glaive shoulder through with a weight that made the rune think it had been triggered early. The flare went off. White, hungry. Sakura flung herself flat, hand over her head, and rolled, smooth from drills she never bragged about because she saved her bragging for grades. Sasuke put 3 shuriken into 3 parts of the same tree and split the trigger wires. Hinata didn't flinch. She called numbers. People lived inside those numbers. They almost didn't catch the courier. The forest's geometry funneled them to a rock shelf with a view of the exam tower's roof. A figure in a gray cloak crossed the roofline with the unbothered walk of someone who belonged where people weren't supposed to go. Naruto should have missed him. The cloak caught no light. It was a piece of bright absence moving along a wire. Right there, Hinata said, voice low and steady, carrying a scroll in his sleeve. The seal is not ours. Courier, Naruto said, and the word had sharp edges that cut the day into before and after. He looked at the world and saw how to make it complicit. Pillars. Align them. Hinata saw immediately. She went ahead with that odd Hyuga glide and put her hand on a fallen trunk. Here. She moved her palm an inch. No. Here. Naruto grabbed one end. Sasuke too. The other with a scowl that softened into something like joy because moving a tree to make a line is a problem you can feel. They eased it so the shadows of 3 separate trees made a continuous paw. From the shelf slipped to the tower's eave. Naruto stepped into that path and felt the river under Bridge Place in his bones open a door. He didn't go. Not yet. He looked at Hinata. She nodded once. He stepped. The world went cool. The space inside the aligned shadows tasted like the inside of a whisper. Soft, secret, intentional. He came out on the eve at a crouch because people who take roofs for granted deserve surprises. The courier didn't have a face under his hood, which is not a metaphor. He wore a flat disc there, a mirror sunk into flesh the way a coin sinks into mud, and a brand on his wrist that pulsed at the same tempo as the lamps in the registration hall had hummed. He walked like everything broke itself to fit him. Naruto intercepted him without a word. Sometimes conversation is generous. Sometimes it gives the wrong thing away. He went for the wrist with the seal pulse because tempo is a rhythm and a rhythm is a thing you can ruin. His hand burned like he'd grabbed a kettle. He held anyway. The world narrowed to the band's throb and Glave's weight on the other side of his shoulder. Delivering late, Naruto said, conversational, because you can be polite while you breaking something that hurts people. Your boss won't like that. The courier's mirror face tilted as if listening to a voice in the glass. He tried to lift his other hand and Naruto put a knee into his hip and made the motion judge itself and turn into falling. They hit the tiles hard enough to make the eve cough dust. The seal writhed under Naruto's palm like a living thing that hates being held. He pushed his domain outward for a heartbeat, just a breath of twilight, and the seal's light stuttered. He felt the gate in himself push alongside Hinata's earlier precision. He took that breath, not more. Because the lamps would notice if he took more here, in the middle of too many eyes. He used the breath like a wedge and pried the courier's hand open. The scroll spilled. Another figure. He reached for it as if the air itself had an arm. Temari's fan cracked open with a percussive snap. She was 2 buildings away, on a parapet where sand had no reason to be. Naruto could have said a lot of things about that. He did not. He said, now, and she swept her fan. Wind slapped the reaching hand's aim aside and sent the scroll clacking against the eve where Naruto's palm was already waiting. The courier went very still. The face disc brightened. It had no features and yet Naruto could feel the shape of intent behind it, a mind that believed in straight lines where people went. You are the door, the courier said without moving his mouth, because he had none. I'm the doorman, Naruto said. And you're drunk. He slammed the mirror face into the tiles with a hard, economical motion, just once. The disc cracked. Not completely. Enough that light leaked the wrong way through the fracture. The body went slack with a sigh that might have been relief. Beneath his hand Naruto felt the brand flutter and fail. A bird hitting a window. He didn't bind the echo. There wasn't one. Sometimes there is only a mechanic, and when you break the machine, what's left is silence. He took the scroll and tucked it into his jacket where the bandage had itched. He heard a soft thud on the next roof, the sound a light-footed person makes landing from a distance without wanting to show off. Temari strolled toward him, both hands on the closed fan as if it were a walking stick. She had a bandage along one forearm and a dangerous look in her eye that wasn't about violence, it was about enjoying the right puzzle a little too much. You owe me, she said. For not stealing that out of your shirt myself. Charge me for coaching, he said. We'll call it even. She stopped just out of easy reach and tilted her head. Don't coach me without paying rent inside my skull, she said, and then she smiled because he'd said it already for her. Kidding. Kind of. I was going to cut his wrist out from under him. Your knee was cleaner. You were going to cut his wrist out from under him, he repeated, dry, stepping past her to the edge of the roof. You sand people have the prettiest solutions. She hooked the fan against his shoulder as if poking him with it would make him more honest. And you leave people pretend to be jumble-headed until somebody puts you in front of a lock. Then suddenly you're very precise. Careful, he said, stepping off the eve into an aligned shadow and out onto the rock shelf where Hinata waited with eyes too bright and breath held at the hinge of a second. He gave the scroll to her. He didn't say, I knew you'd be there. He didn't need to. Back in the forest, a different kind of light went off, the sudden white of flash tags popping like fireworks where a genin had decided they would rather blind the competition than lose. The tags weren't lethal, by design, but they were cruel. The boy who threw them laughed without humor and charged the nearest silhouette, kunai low and sloppy. Naruto cut him off. He didn't need to step. He just moved like people do who have trained their bodies to be arguments that end conversations. He caught the boy's wrist, tilted it so the kunai thought about dropping, and then set his palm flat to the boy's chest without pushing. "No more," he said. The boy had the look people get when they have decided being a monster is easier than being the person they are ashamed to be. He spat a slur trying to make Naruto the wrong kind of target. Naruto looked at him the way he looked at mirrors, with a calculation you can't teach, only learn by falling through one. When the fight finished, the boy lay on his side, wind gone, eyes watering from his own flash. He wasn't dying. He wasn't innocent. He had that flicker at the edge of him like all people who do something they can't take back. Naruto felt the echo tug toward him as if curious at the new thing he was in the world. Naruto stepped back. "No," he said aloud, to the echo, to himself. "Not you." Hinata gave him one long, full look. She didn't fill it with words. He nodded once and something in her shoulders loosened because her fear hadn't been that he couldn't be strong. It was that he wouldn't choose to be kind. They made the tower with bruises and one less heliotrope sucking at the corners of the exam. Proctors took scrolls with the board importance of clerks at a bank where the bills might bite. The preliminary fights were announced with a promise that sounded like a threat. One-on-one, elimination, don't embarrass your village. Naruto watched from the stands with palms braced on the rail and the hum of the lights drilling behind his eyes. The lamps around the ring were brighter than any exam needed. Someone had over-engineered, or they wanted, a certain boy to notice how ground feels when light erases it. Rock Lee dropped into a stance that made even the arrogant quiet. Opposite him, a genin with soft hands and sun-etched leather along his forearms smiled like someone with a clever knife tucked under a napkin. The first exchange was clean. Lee closed, shin whipping. The other boy snapped his wrist and a ribbon of light cut the air where Lee had been. The crowd gasped, not because of the trick. Tricks are old in the exam, but because the ribbon burned a line into the wall that didn't stop at plaster. "Lanterns," Hinata said from Naruto's left, voice nodding toward the lamps. "Their filaments are wrong." "Trap," Naruto said. He looked at the field and saw the angles the lamps made when you drew lines between their poles. He saw the places between those lines where a person could breathe unobserved for the length of a heartbeat. He took a breath that length and let his domain flicker, the tiniest pulse of twilight, not an act of war, just an exhale. The lamps buzzed, stuttered, dimmed so quickly it might have been dust on a wire. Lee didn't waste a god gift. He cut inside the ribbon's next pass and drove a heel into the other boy's knee. Then 2 fingers into a shoulder nerve he had learned in a different kind of pain. The light ribbon hiccuped and went slack. The boy went down, not for long, but long enough for Lee to nt a foot just so and bow because he was polite even to people who tried to cut parts off him. The crowd roared like a stadium likes to, as if they had also won a small private fight. The lamps recovered, bright, offended. The proctor rubbed the back of his neck and muttered about maintenance. Naruto let his breath go back to ordinary size and pretended very hard not to know anything about anything. Hinata didn't say a word. Her fingers found the inside of the rail, white-knuckled, then let go deliberately. Backstage smelled like canvas and chalk and the kind of adrenaline that tastes like pennies in your mouth. Tamari leaned against a wall, counting splinters with her thumbnail, watching a warden hiding in a sand shunen's clothes try to look invisible. He had mirrors sewn into his sleeves the way a stingray hides a stinger. Naruto saw him and didn't let his gaze stick. He let his posture lengthen a little, the way a man's does when he's already faced the worst thing today and found he had something left. "You going to stand there and coach with your eyes again?" Tamari asked without looking at him. "Depends," he said. "You going to listen with yours?" She chuckled. "Don't get cute." He didn't. He watched the warden's handler, the man with a paper pass and 2 clean hands, angle toward a side corridor where a panel of frosted glass disguised a maintenance chase. He wanted to say something clever. He made a choice instead. He cut off the handler mid-step, shoulder to shoulder as if he hadn't noticed the collision, then made room, then didn't. It forced the handler to stop or be obvious. The handler stopped. He smiled like men do when their knives aren't ready to be pointed yet. "Sorry," Naruto said easily. "Nerves." He lowered his voice as if confiding something. Big night. You look like you enjoy big nights. The handler said, too kind. I like sleeping after, Naruto said, and then, looking past the man's ear, your right heel. It wasn't addressed to the handler. It was a sentence thrown into the air at a very particular time. Temari was already moving. The warden in Chunin clothes had pivoted to try to ruin a corner. Naruto's words reached the part of her BR. Aim that liked being faster than boys and hooked into it. She ducked left as if she'd been planning to for hours and swept low. Her fan's edge kissed his heel in a sound like silk. The mirror sewn inside the hem gave a stressed squeal. The warden stumbled, tried to recover, and met a handful of wind shape he hadn't studied enough. He hit the wall and went down with the sound men make when the fight isn't a game anymore. Temari turned her head a fraction, eyes cutting sidelong at Naruto. That's rent, she said. Consider it a month in advance, he said. The handler smiled too broadly. Clever, he said, which is the sort of thing people say when they're adding you to a list. He turned as if to leave and found Yugao already there, in a place where there had been no person a moment ago. Her mask was off. Her face was still. It stopped him like a wall stops a thrown cup. Inspection, she said pleasantly, and opened his sleeve with a flick of her short blade. A coil of very fine wire rolled out, and along it little triangular mirrors bright enough to cut a shadow if you fed them hunger. Your paperwork. He offered a placard with the kind of smile men use when they expect paper to forgive them. She did not touch it. No, she said. Your paperwork. He ran. He should not have. He carried too much light in a room that belonged to people who loved the places under things. Naruto PPED sideways into the scuffed darkness beneath a bench where chalk had fallen and out into the handler's own heel shadow because people always tell the truth about where they place their weight. Aim up with a palm under the man's chin and pressure just enough to stop a word from becoming a shout. The handler had a brand under his cuff. It pulsed a command that wanted to be a scream. Temari's. Fan snapped open again and the world's air rearranged itself into obedience. The command went sideways and failed. Yugao's blade kissed the brand against the man's wrist and nicked it, just enough to bleed light. The man sagged as if clipped from his tether. Brand, Yugao said. From the tribunal. Report to the Hokage. It sounded like a recipe because life is easier when you keep your knives in steps you can follow. The preliminaries sprawled late enough for yawns to become a strategic weapon. Enko made a show of slapping the wall clock and threatening to fight it herself. People laughed back. Their bodies wanted to stop shaking. Naruto didn't take the floor. Not tonight. He did enough. He stood on the rail and let his presence be a rest note between songs. Every time the lamps tried a little something, brightening too cleanly, chopping a corner too precisely, he shrugged the room 2 degrees toward twilight for a heartbeat and gave someone on the floor a chance to make a right choice instead of the forced one. At the far edge of it all, Tenten stood in profile, chin up, spear in hand, the shadow metal bead he'd given her forged into a collapsible shaft that drank light. She had made it look like nothing until it mattered. She flicked it open, thought at it, and it lengthened past a guard's expectation and tapped a wrist at the exact rhythm Naruto had learned to hate. The thing sang, quiet enough for the person holding it to hear and no one else. Pretty, he said later, finding her as the crowd thinned. It wants to be something, she said, eyes on the joint where metal became not metal. Most metal just wants to rest. It wants to be useful, he said. She glanced up at him, an unreadable glint there. So do you. He thought of a door under a river that had opened because he asked and almost laughed. Apparently. You look like you're about to fall over, she said, which had become a chorus in his life lately. I'm practicing staying up, he said. How's my form? Terrible, she said, and offered him the spear. Hold this while I tighten the collar, hero. He held it. It was heavier than it looked, and in his palm the bead hummed low and approving, like a cat confronted by a beam of sun with no intention of moving. He didn't try to name the feeling aloud. He handed the spear back as if passing a secret between friends. It should have ended with paperwork and insults traded on the street. Late ramen a prize for doing something that mattered but didn't look like it from far away. It didn't. The lamps around the arena roof took a deep breath and didn't exhale. The hum that had threaded the day pulled itself into a line and plucked. The note climbed out of the range of ordinary ears. Naruto felt it in his teeth. Hinata's eyes widened, Byakugan blooming, veins delicate and fierce. Up, she said, and that was all she had to say. They went outside. The night had been clear. It wasn't now. A disc hung over Konoha, as precise as a coin on a pillow. It was too perfect. The edges made your eyes tired. It shouldn't have been there because nothing that clean belongs over a city made of 1,000 imperfect roofs and the mess of people and the soft edges where one life leans into another. It glowed like a sun does when it is young and mean. Shadows thinned to strings. A cat tried to walk under a cart and found it couldn't because there wasn't an under anymore. There was only space without shape. Temari stopped beside Naruto and tilted her head as if testing wind. That's not weather, she said. No, Naruto said. Yugao came up on his other side with the quiet step of bad news. Sevenfold Archon, she said, like a person naming a storm after hearing it for the first time and knowing it had always existed under another name. We knew a light priest. We did not know a minister. Naruto watched the disc and didn't move. He could feel the gate in his chest getting very still. Inside that stillness was a memory of a heartbeat that multiplied itself in times of need. Inside that memory was the sound of Glaive's silent footstep at his left shoulder, the weight of responsibility that had not started this week and wouldn't end when he said please. On the far side of the square, the little shrine from the night before flickered with a light too shy to look at the new disc. The priest wasn't there, or he was in 10 other places at once. He disc sang a note too clean to be anything but judgment. Naruto rolled his shoulders like a man about to pick up something heavier than smart people try to lift, and said, let's go wake the Hokage. Hinata glanced at him. A question she did not speak curled in her mouth. He answered with his chin. She stepped to his side with a long exhale and an entire clan worth of careful in her gaze. Temari flipped her fan open and set it on her shoulder as if at a festival. Tenten slid the new spear onto a strap like she'd meant to sleep with it. Yugao adjusted nothing and made the air shift anyway, Iway a blade changes the room by simply existing. Overhead, the false sun hummed louder, greedy for a world without corners. Naruto took one step forward and the thin shadow under his heel deepened as if happy. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. He had a rule that mattered more than whatever that thing wanted to make of him. You don't let something big decide what you are just because it's big. The village held its breath alongside the lamps. Leaves argued with the air. Somewhere, a dog barked once and went silent, because even dogs understand when the sky is wrong. On me, Naruto said, not loud, not a shout, not for effect. The sentence was tune, and the tune found throats. People around him stopped fidgeting and started moving. Sakura peeled off to the hospital with a list of tasks no one had given her. Sasuke cracked his knuckles and rolled his head and smiled in a way that meant one thing only, finally. Shikamaru muttered, troublesome, and then started counting under his breath. Already finding places to put lazy boys where they'd do the most good. Lee tied his bandage tighter and hummed a song he probably thought no one heard. Ino took 3 deep breaths and went to stand where gossip gives ground to news. It wasn't magic. It was clarity. It was deciding early and letting that decision change how people hold themselves. He didn't draw the gate wide. Not yet. He didn't think he needed to. The disc above the village shone, and if the light wanted to make a lesson of him, it could pick a different student. Naruto had his own. Command is not volume, Yugao had said. He felt the words sit under his feet like a floor. He walked on it. Above them, the disc quivered, seeking purchase in a city not built for surrender. It hummed again. The pitch sharpened into something like a blade. Naruto squared his shoulders to it without bowing. If you want me, he said, to the sky, to the priest with the mirror wrist, to the men who bring lamps to a knife fight, you already know where I'll be. He turned his back on the false sun and led his people into the shadow of the Hokage's tower, which was as thin as thread and enough. Chapter 2 End. Chapter 3. Black steel, red strings. Hokage meetings always smell like ink and rain. Even when it isn't raining, the stone of the tower keeps a damp memory of storms in the mortar. Scrolls lay open like ribs on the table. The fowls. E-sun above Konoha made every corner thin, every shadow flimsy, like the building had been drawn with a hard pencil and then erased badly. Naruto leaned against the window frame and watched the disc tremble very slightly in the night. He could feel it trying to steady itself, hunting an angle to erase the last threads of shape off the rooftops. If he asked the gate in his chest to answer that insult, it would. He didn't. The room was full of people who needed him to be a boy and a blade and a calm all at once. Lumen interference isn't random, Shikamaru said, too tired to flatten his hair, too awake to pretend he didn't care. He tapped a scroll with his knuckle. It's a pattern drawn across the forest and the tower-like thread around a package. This, he dragged 2 fingers to show 2 points on the map, is where the thread was tied off. Borderlands. Empty on the roster. Which is a lie. Hinata stood with her hands folded and the Byakugan so close to surfacing that her temples had the faintest flowers of veins. In the lamp-washed bright she looked ethereal to strangers. Naruto knew better. That stillness was discipline trying not to become impatience. They took a copy of my field map, she said evenly. From the courier's sleeve, he was carrying a list of angles I drew in the tower. I didn't notice I was being watched. That last sentence came out quiet but hard, a self-judg. Meant she had no intention of sharing with anyone else. He heard it anyway. Then we go get it back, Naruto said. And anything they brought to the party with it. He didn't look at the Hokage like as king permission because this wasn't that. The old man blew out a slow breath through his nose and gave a nod that was both benediction and warning. Don't start a war and don't pretend you can avoid one. Yugao, the Hokage said, without moving his eyes off Naruto. You stand as blade to the boy's spine. Understood, Yugao said, as if agreeing to pick up milk on her way home. Tenten met them at tea. He tower steps with a bundle on her back and the kind of grin that says she has already solved the first problem and is hungry for the second. If this is a bad idea, she said, falling in beside Naruto, save me a piece of it. 2. Naruto said. She watched the disc overhead and made a face. I hate tidy circles. They hate you more, he said. Mutual, she said cheerfully. They moved before tea. He village could grow certain the false sun was just decoration. Naruto didn't tell anyone left behind that certainty is a lie light tells you before it eats the dark out of your house. The road flexed under dawn. Mist hung in the cones of the pines. His team ran soft. They left the big road early for the smaller paths that remembered feet instead of wheels. Somewhere around the 3rd hour the air changed. Oil and old paper and a sweetness that wasn't plant. Hinata lifted her hand and they sank into a low crouch as if the forest had asked them to take off their shoes. Heliotrope nets, she breathed. Shallow. They want to herd, not catch. Good, Naruto said. I like disappointing shepherds. They dipped under a lattice of faint light threads and up through a game trail that smelled like deer and last winter. Where the trail widened and turned, wind poured into the notch and made a long, low note. Tamari stepped out from behind a deadfall and checked their weapons with her eyes like a hostess making sure you brought the right bottle to the party. I was in the neighborhood, she said, unrepentant. Sand scouts like quiet. She had left hers 3 ridges back, likely with orders to count everything that breathed. Her bandage from the night before had been replaced with one folded cleaner, which meant she had done it herself. Before you asked. Yes, I'm supposed to be here. By the time the paperwork catches up, it'll be true. Naruto's mouth tugged at one corner. You bring a receipt. She flicked her fan open 3 inches and shut it. For you, Leaf. All invoice in attitude. Paid in full, he said. And moved aside without ceremony. She slid into formation as if she had always been the space between Tenten's quip and Yugao's quiet. The borderlands weren't empty, like the roster had soothed. They were the kind of empty that means you can buy quiet if you pay with the right kind of wrong. The trail spat them into a ravine where the stone had been carved not by water but by men with time. Jars lined shelves cut into the rock. The jars held light, liquid, slow, a pulse like a sleeping thing. Snakes slept coiled around and through the glasswork. It should have been ridiculous. It was precise, and precision is a way to be cruel. Oto, Tenten murmured, nose wrinkled. Snake people basement. Comforting, Naruto said. Reassuring, Tamari agreed. Yugao flicked 2 fingers at the nearest jar. They harvest bioluminescence and feed its seals, she assessed like a baker glancing into an oven. It keeps, barely, enough to make a bad place to be a shadow. And a great place to mock light when it slips, Naruto said. He palmed a jar. The glass was warm and slick. He could feel the thready pulse trying to decide what kind of thing he was. He put it down. Hinata pointed. Guard rotation. 5. 2 wearing brands. 1 is, more. She was careful with that word in the way you are careful with a knife you don't know the name for yet. The, more, moved in a way that made angles where there should be curves. The prismatic armor he wore split the sunlight that oozed down the ravine like honey. Tenten's voice went academic for a blink. You see the refractive panes along his sleeves. If you hit those with a blunt, the light will. Temari coughed a laugh. You mean it'll turn into a needle aimed at the nearest friend. Got it. The man in prismatic armor stepped into the wider space with the composure of someone who had drilled in front of mirrors. The plates on his shoulders caught the light and separated it into neat, lethal fans that patted the ground as if looking for a throat. He raised 2 fingers and the jars brightened, a soft cathedral glow. The ravine became a church of knives. Back, Yugao said, but without rushing the word. The advice landed in E. Very body like a reminder not to stand in the center of a room that hates you. Naruto made a choice. He didn't step toward the prismatic man. He stepped toward the wall where the jars sat. The reflect ions in their glass were thin and tentative, first ideas of a shadow, not fully committed. He reached, not for the easiest dark, but for the place behind the reflection where the reflection of that reflection didn't quite know how to behave. His ankle stung. His ribs reminded him that glass cut. He went anyway. The reflected shadow under his palm flexed like a throat learning to swallow. He pushed, and went through the mirror's recorded shade like slipping a coin under a door. He came out of the prismatic man's forearm where the pain met leather. It was a bad angle for any attacker. The man had the sense to flinch anyway. Naruto drove 2 knuckles into the seam with a white confidence built from 100 improvised bad ideas that turned good because he committed. The pain spidered. Light split wrong, messy. Left pane compromised, Hinata called, precise and calm. 3 degrees. 3 degrees, Temari repeated as if telling the wind a secret. She flicked the fan. The refraction that should have turned into a killing spear instead went wild, smeared into a harmless ribbon over shale. Tenten was already moving, the new collapsible spear a line in her hand. She flicked it open and said the way it drank light to create a black seam that the prismatic man's other pane slid along as if attracted to the dark. The pane kissed the seam and chipped. He tried to recover. Yugao's blade, hoard and unadorned, tapped the hinge of his right elbow with the exactly wrong weight. Pain teaches faster than doctrine. He folded without grace. They didn't cheer. You don't cheer a mechanic you bear. Lee understand giving you a pass this time. Take him. Sasuke would have asked, if he were here to lean on the word like a dare. Naruto didn't. He looked at the man. The set of his jaw locked around an idea so hard his teeth might crack. The way his shadow quivered like it wasn't sure if it belonged to the body making it. Naruto felt the echo tug, a click in his chest that had become familiar. He let it tug and didn't pull. Not you, he said, softly, and the tug became disappointment and then nothing. They broke the jars in a rhythm that felt like dancing through a polite party in a borrowed suit. Tenten's spear found weak spots in the shelves. Hinata's palm pressed and released seals with the care of someone performing surgery. Temari leaned cattish and bored until her fan snapped and a shelf collapsed inward. Lights snuffing with shy sighs. Naruto used the reflected step again and again until his teeth ached from swallowing the wrong kind of light. Glaive trotted his left flank, presence as steady as a rhythm section. When they were done, the ravine felt like a cellar after someone had pulled the cork out of a keg that had been forgotten for years. The air breathed again, deeper in. The glow switched from jars to lines. The corridor walls had been etched with thin tracks of seal script that drank the bioluminescence like a mouth at a spring. In that glow sat a room built of panes and lenses like the insides of a camera taught to worship the sun. It held people the way a kaleidoscope holds flowers. Prettily, intentionally, cruel. Bands crossed throats and wrists with edges that had too much opinion about what hands should do in a good world. They found her there, hair dark as wet paper, skin too pale under a red brand that had eaten careful circles into her shoulder. She watched them come in with a composure that wasn't calm, more like a person in a dentist's chair pretending not to hear the drill. When Hinata crouched, the woman tipped her chin in a tiny, size nod out of respect for someone who came from a clan that knew about eyes. Karen, she said before any of them could speak, and then half smiled at Naruto's surprise. It's on my chart, Uzumaki. Try not to get sentimental about it. We don't know each other. Fair, Naruto said. Her gaze flicked to Yugao, to Temari, to Tenten. She took inventory with the practice of someone who had watched dangerous rooms for years and survived. When her eyes came back to Naruto, she didn't bother to pretend she liked what she saw. You're hot, you're loud, and something in you makes that brand want to behave. I can feel it trying to decide if it's attached to me or to the story it wants to tell about me. We can cut it, Naruto said. Karen snorted. With what? A moral. Tenten had the grace to choke on a laugh and pretend it was a cough. Better knife, Naruto said. Give me a minute. She raised a brow. A minute like a shinobi tells a civilian it'll be fine, or a minute like someone who is about to do something stupid but correct. The second kind, he said. Then I'm listening, she said, and very deliberately didn't scream when a ward on her wrist bit. She bit back. They couldn't do the cutting in the room with all that glass and obedience. Yugao didn't have to say it, the air itself made the case. So they made a camp 2 ridges over, in a fold of land that liked to hug noise instead of broadcast it. They hid their fire like spies hide smiles and let the heat be something only their hands knew about. The night sky above the ravine had the murky clarity of places where light is manufactured and not earned. Here, the stars remembered how to be teeth. Tenten laid her bundle out like a ritual she didn't want named. An anvil the size of a stubborn rabbit. Tongs. A hammer whose handle had dark oil in the woodgrain where a hand had loved it for years. Naruto sat, hands on his knees, and inhaled until he could feel the gate climb from his chest into his mouth, a quiet tasting of metal and midnight. He thought of all the places that light pretends not to see, behind a nail, in the seam of a book, under a lover's joined hands. He held up both palms. The shadow in the firelight under his skin gathered as if shyly. He pulled, just enough to make it condense like breath on a pane becoming a word. A bead formed. It wasn't black, it was a slow gray that made the air around it fuzz as if ashamed to be the wrong color. It sat in his hand like an apology and a dare. Tenten watched it with expressionless delight. Again, she said. He did. 3 beads. His head felt light after, not weak, exactly, but hollowed in a way he didn't entirely hate, room made where something large might sit if asked kindly. He passed the beads. Tenten caught them with tongs and made herself small with focus. This is yours, she said to the bead, quiet and without embarrassment. Not his. He can call you. I will ask you different things. The first strike was careful. She didn't know yet how the stuff would sulk when hit. It didn't sulk. It buckled and then changed like a promise deciding to keep itself. The singing started on the third hit, a low note that was not sound. It was the idea of sound walking home. Yugao came to stand with her arms folded and her mouth a thin line of approval she would never waste on a word. Temari leaned with that lazy sand posture that hides how much she is calculating. Hinata stood where the fire could push warmth into her hands and watched Naruto watch Tenten work. He wasn't staring at the metal. He was staring at how someone makes a shape out of Saint Ubornus without lying about what the material is. The spear had been an argument. This would be a sentence. Tenten turned the bead, hammered, turned it again, condensed edges from possibility into geometry. The blade that grew didn't drink light so much as make light want to go sit somewhere else and think about what it had done. She held it up. It was lean and longer than the anvil should have been able to host a minute ago. The chill that came off it wasn't cold, it was a tension. Naruto reached but didn't touch. It's not finished, Tenten said, not protective, just accurate. Edges are the last thing. Edges make men foolish. She looked at Yugao. Will you cut the first line? Yugao nodded and took the blade. She didn't test it like young shinobi do, no swishes and flourishes. He held it as if to a seam in the air only she could see and drew it down very slowly, wrist steady. Nothing happened, which is how you know a thing worked. No drama, just the world consenting to be different. This is a promise you can't break. She said. Not to Naruto, not to Tenten, but to the blade. What's it called? Temari asked, because naming matters when you want to pick something up again later and ask it to behave the same. Ask the idiot who bled for it, Tenten said. Knight's Edge, Naruto said, and didn't flinch at how grand that sounded, because it fit and because just then, across the ridge, in the direction of the jars and their polite, cruel light, a shout climbed the air and fell. Not from their camp, from the place they had wrecked. What now? Temari asked the way a woman asks a kettle to stop boiling over. Wardens, Hinata said, Byakugan waking so fast it must have hurt. And, someone running. She turned her head toward Naruto, eyes bright and soft around the pupils. She's running toward our noise. Help that makes its own way is worth something, Yugao said, and slid the blade into a sheath Tenten had built while they weren't looking. Of course she had. Me. The runner where the ravine choked into a notch and spilled shadow like a pocket turned out. She wore Oto wrapped over civilian, meaning she had done somebody's work for years and hated it from inside the right uniform. A sunbrand crawled across her ribs like a bad vine. Pursuers bit at her heels. 2 wardens, a handler with mirrors under his fingernails like manicured murder, and a man with a low-ing face and longer patience taking notes in his head for his boss. The woman had that kind of courage Naruto respects more than cliff jumping, the kind that sidesteps a better option and makes the hard one because it's right. She knew she was going to die. She had chosen a direction anyway. Naruto met her halfway, palm up. She put her hand in his without looking at his face as if the hand was a br. And she had no patience left for showing gratitude. They're sealing people in glass, she panted. Making us glow like livestock. It erases scars. What else? Naruto said. He had learned that women like her will tell you the right thing if you ask right. He kept his voice small so she wouldn't have to step up to it and do the work. It erases choosing, she said. She shook once and then low. Cked it down because fear is a muscle you can build. I'm going back to break the last of it. I can get the children out. The brand, she tapped it like a talisman she had finally admitted was a trap, tells on me. Naruto looked at the wardens. The ready mirror under a sleeve. The handler's boots. How long it would take to bind one echo, 2, and what he would break in himself if he dipped his hand into that well too easily. He looked at the woman the way he had looked at the mercenary captain, searching for the spark that was choice, not luck. If I fall, she said, crisp now, like issuing a memo. If I fall, and my body is afraid, and my mind is not, and you can. She swallowed and didn't say the word like she was a believer because she wasn't. She was tired and done. Ask me first. I will, he said. She took 2 steps and went down because the handler skipped the flourish and threw a knife like a man who'd spent years telling himself he wasn't a killer. The blade bit her hip and dragged. The wardens surged to finish a thing they didn't start. Temari laughed without humor and shredded the air. Yugao cut a wrist with surgical insult. Hinata called the angle that would snap a knee without breaking the leg. Tenten put Knight's Edge under a beam of manufactured light and made the beam decide to go somewhere else for 5 delicate beats. Naruto stepped through a reflected shadow in a shard of broken jar on the ground and put himself where the handler's gaze didn't account for boys stepping out of the wrong dark. The handler landed on stone with a noise men make when they realize gravity doesn't take bribes. The wardens faced 4 women and learned a lesson about who has time for their doctrine. Naruto knelt in the woman's shadow where it lay thin and beaded with dust. He looked at him and didn't plead because she had run out of pleading days. He pitched his voice down to where people keep the part of themselves that doesn't care whether it wins, only whether it kept faith. Do you want to keep fighting? He asked. The brand on her ribs crawled with a greedy little itch. She set her teeth and hummed her answer through the ache. Not a word, not a gesture. He saw it in the muscles at the corner of her eye and in the way she pushed her knee down into the dirt as if cutting herself a place to stand even while she bled. Yes, he said, making her choice audible so it could hear itself. He pressed his palm flat. The gate opened like a book to a page that had been dog-eared for this. Shadow uncurled, stood, inclined its head to her body as if bowing to a general who had briefed it. It was small, quick, signless. It turned its head like listening. Veil, Naruto said, because names matter and because this one felt like sound pulled thin and made into touch. The new echo reached its hands out and pressed them into the air where words are thin. Sound rippled against its palms. Around them, the wardens' footfalls sounded wrong, too loud to hide in. Yugao smiled very slightly. The woman exhaled as if someone had taken a weight from her lungs. She pressed her palm, not at her brand, but at the place beside it where a little girl had once pressed a blue chalk. LK handprint and said, "I'll grow into you. Thank you," she whispered to nobody. When she died, it was tidy, because even dying can be done neat if you've decided where to put your last mess. Naruto didn't bind the wardens. The handler tried to crawl toward a jar to see if it had anything left to tell him he was important. Tamari put her heel on his wrist and leaned, her eye gone cold in a way that was not cruel, it was bored of cruelty. "Don't," she suggested. He obeyed. They took the woman's body to the fold in the land where the stars had teeth and laid her where she could hear leaves arguing about tomorrow. Hinata set her hands along the woman's arms with reverence and made certain the muscles relaxed. Tenten cut a strip of her own bandana and tied the woman's hair so it would be smooth. Because small things are what stop the big grief from eating you. Naruto stood and listened to the new echo learn the language of wind in grass, because he could, because Vale would be louder tomorrow when it understood its own edges. Karen sat with her back to a tree and watched them without blinking. "You ask," she said, almost annoyed. "You actually ask. It's slower," Naruto admitted, because truth-telling saves you time later. "It's decent," Karen said. "That's different. Decency is embarrassing. God, I missed it." She brought her hand up to rub the brand on her shoulder and winced. "All right, idiot," she said to Naruto. "Half surrender, half dare. Get your better knife." They made the room for the cutting out of night and discipline. Hinata stood behind Karen because sight matters when you can't afford to blink. "On my mark," she said, and Naruto felt the gate shiver at the sound of her voice turned into metronome. He let the domain slip a hair, just enough to soften the era. Round the brand so it would think it had been left alone. Karen exhaled a clean line of breath. Tenten placed Knight's edge where the edge of the ugly circle decided it was brave. Yugao's hand rested L-eyed on Karen's shoulder to keep her body from trying to tell the wrong muscles to tense at the exact wrong time. "Now," Hinata said. Naruto pulled the twilight across the brand like a veil that told light it had a place to be. And this wasn't it. Tenten cut. Knight's edge did the job like it had been built for it in a story one of them had told themselves back when they were children and howled at things that would not love them back. The brand lifted. Blood talked. Karen's spine arched, but she didn't make a sound. Yugao's hand got heavy exactly where it would teach breath to stay. The piece of light they pulled off Karen's shoulder tried to be a spider. Naruto cupped it. It scorched him and died like a lie caught mid-sentence. Karen breathed like a runner finally seeing the last corner of a street she knows. She swore in a language made of gratitude and irritation and flopped sideways, cheek to the dirt. "I'm going to throw up." "Do it there," Tenten said, practical. "Not in the forge." Karen did it there. When she finished, she wiped her mouth with the dignity of a queen recognizing she had dethroned something lesser. She laughed, brittle and wonderful. "Okay," she said, still breathless. "Now I help you ruin someone else's day." She took Naruto's wrist with 2 fingers and hissed. "Not pain. Assessment. You taste like a deadline," she said. "You've got a clock on you, idiot." He glanced up at the sky where the false sun hovering over Konoha was just a smear from here. "I usually do. They put a seed in your orbit," she said, eyes distant, sensor brain tuned to a rhythm nobody else could hear. "It's humming at the edges of your domain. You're pretending not to feel it because you don't like being told to dance." "Welcome to the team," Tamari said dryly. "You'll fit right in." Karen snorted and held out her forearm. "I like my blood in me, but if you need it, take it. I am not a field medic, I am a censor, and a good one, and an average liar. Also, if any of you bite me without asking, I will gut you." Quote. "Duly noted," Naruto said, deadpan, and the laugh that went around their little fire cracked something heavy. Even Yugao's mouth remembered that the shape called smile is not a betrayal. They slept in shifts. Naruto took the last watch so Hinata could have the hour before sunrise when dreams are softest. He stood with his back to the dying fire and counted breaths in a way that doesn't come from training. It comes from deciding you will live long enough to do the thing you promised. Hinata woke before her turn. She came to stand beside him without the choreography of people who worry about where to put their hands. He didn't speak. She didn't either. The silence wasn't awkward. It was attentive. I was afraid, she said finally, voice shaped without apology. That you would choose power because it listens to you when people don't. That you wouldn't stop to ask. Her hand made a small motion as if she were measuring something between finger and thumb. I don't want anything I can't look in the face after, he said. He kept his gaze on the place where the night had begun, deciding to be morning. When I step, I have to know who I am when I arrive. Otherwise, it's just jumping. You did ask. She looked down at his hand, not taking it yet. You will forget too, someday. I'll make it rare, he said. He didn't promise never. He wasn't a liar. She slid her fingers into his. No ceremony. The warmth that climbed his wrist wasn't heat. It was calm. Then I'll remind you, she said, simple as a grocery list, a weather report, a prayer. Okay, he said, relief running quieter than his breath. Deal. A twig snapped. Vale turned her head, the movement small, attention moving through the air around them like a hand through a curtain. Karen S. At up in one motion the way only hunted people do, and every muscle in her neck wrote its name. Tamari rolled onto one elbow with the kind of energy that makes boys swear they weren't sleeping. Yugao was already standing, which made no sense until you remembered that some people don't truly lie down, ever. He wasn't a priest. He wasn't a warden. He wasn't human in the way that maps care about. The sevenfold archon stepped into the ragged light of their fire the way a tall judgment steps into a classroom at the exact moment a note is being passed. He wore no armor except for the not light that hung off him like glass that had learned to be angry. The lines of him were too clean. Men who were real cut into the world. He was a diagram someone had decided would be superior to men and then loved that idea too long. Your gate, he said to Naruto, in a voice designed to make nouns kneel and verbs sit up straight. It is a door to a cage. I can free you from the need to look back at those you bind. Naruto didn't move. It wasn't courage. It was spite. He held still because the archon wanted him to bow. I don't need you to teach me cruelty, he said. I could be perfect at that alone. The archon considered him with interest that was not human care, but it was attention, and attention changes rooms. He tilted his head as if disappointed and delighted all at once, the way a teacher looks at a prodigy who won't do the easy thing. He lifted his hand. Above their camp, the stars thickened, then thinned, and then something took a breath that the world felt. The second artificial sun ignited. It was smaller than the one over Konoha. Newer, meaner. The edges were wrong, as if someone had hurried the finishing work because the sight of them bored him. The shadows around their camp didn't vanish. They were pulled thin. Stretched like spun sugar and just as ready to snap. Temari's fan came up, not as threat, but as posture. Tenten reached for Night's Edge without thinking about wanting to. I want to was already a decision somewhere between her fingers and the hilt. Karen's hand found Naruto's forearm in a grip that didn't ask permission. Yugao stood loose as a calm blade. Hinata tightened her fingers in his. It was nothing more than that. It was enough. Sovereign's call tugged in his chest. Do something, it sang, do the right thing once and early. Naruto smiled. Too many teeth again. Because he had a talent for ruining perfect circles. You want me, he said to the archon, to the sky, to the thing inside his chest that wanted to push. You know where I'm going to be. The arc. Hun's lips made the idea of a smile and then decided against the messy follow-through of letting it become one. Grow, he said. We will make a better story if you grow. He stepped back without moving his feet. The sun heat hung above them hummed in sympathy with the larger one over Konoha. Two notes, too pure, grinding in the space between. The archon disappeared as if someone had snipped his OUT line off the page and left the blankness behind. Naruto looked up into the new noon. The edges of it scraped his eyes like sand. He kept looking anyway. He wasn't a fool. He was a student of the thing that wanted to crush him. Because you don't get to choose your teacher in a fight. You only choose what you do with the lesson. He squeezed Hinata's hand once. She squeezed back. Tenten rolled her shoulder until the blade settled in a channel in her grip as if it had been poured there. Tamari laughed once with no sound in it at all. Karen whispered, I can hear the timing in its light. I can break it. Yugao didn't say a thing. Her silence steadied the air. Then we make our better story, Naruto said, low and sure. He could feel his own pulse lining up for the next bad idea that would become the right one if he committed. He stepped forward into the thin shadow under his own heel and felt it firm beneath him out of sheer stubbornness. Somewhere between this heartbeat and the next, a city would need saving. A sun would need dragging, a blade would need to remember how to be a promise. For now, 5 people and 2 echoes stood in a ring of light that hated them and refused to hate themselves back. Chapter 3 End. Chapter 4. The War That Looked Like Noon. They crossed the ridge at a run and saw noon nailed to the horizon. It wasn't the noon you grow up with, the one that comes like a friend you're used to ignoring. This one had edges. Over Kurohama, the old fire country port with black sand and crooked alleys, the sky wore a second sun as if a god had ordered a counterfeit from a shop that didn't do refunds. The thing hummed in a pitch you felt more than heard, the air itself sounding like a taut string. Shadow ban arrays, Karen said, breath easy despite the pace. Her gaze went distant. There's a pulse buried under the hum. 1 2, hold, 1 2, hold. It eats the spaces between. Naruto tasted the rhythm through her words, like a drummer's count barely disguised as wind. His body wanted to answer with a beat of its own. He kept his stride even. Kurohama came into full view in a cough of salt air. The tide was half out, leaving pools in the black sand. The second sun pinned everything to the ground. Men and women moved like sleepwalkers under harsh light because there weren't shadows to lean into. Even the boats in the harbor looked sketched wrong, like a child had erased the undersides to make them float. Hinata stopped for half a second and blinked. Veins flowered at her temples. The arrays are strung along the waterfront and the bell tower and the customs house. Mirrors linked by a seal lattice. They're thinning every angle. Tamari squinted up, shielding her eyes with the flat of her fan. He hates corners, she said. Let's give him 1,000. Split, Yugao said, not loud. She pointed briefly. Hinata with veil, map the underground and get us a spine. Tenten, anchors, anything that makes shade last where it shouldn't. Tamari, put wind on the smoke. Karen, break the timing in their pulse. Naruto, give them a plan to move to. He finished, because the word leader always tastes better after you prove you're not in love with hearing it. They at the edge of the city and Kurohama hit back immediately. Light fell off the false sun like clean rain. It cut under awnings, ate the hollows of stairs. A stray dog tried to crawl under a cart and whined, confused. When its belly found nothing to hide it, Naruto stepped toward its thin thread of a shadow and felt it resist him like cold gum. The step almost stuck. His ankle sang with the memory of the river's door. Don't, Hinata said sharply, then softer. Save it for when it matters. Everything matters, he said, but he stepped back out of habit and respect. But, okay. Kurohama was loud, not with conversation, with metal under strain, with the clatter of nets that had lost their hooks and didn't know it yet, with the way men swear when they carry a grandfather down a too bright STR. EET and have to pretend their hands aren't burning. Smoke from a boat fire at the docks hung thick, but even it struggled to make shade. The false sun wrung it out like cloth and spread it thin. Tamar, I jammed her fan into the dirt of the square and snapped it open once. Wind ran like a dog happy to be allowed off the leash. She didn't direct it at the fire. She skimmed along the roofs and pushed the smoke sideways, slow and deliberate. Until the haze formed a long, listing ceiling from the cannery to the alehouse row. It cast a moving gray the arrays hadn't planned for. There, she said, like telling the world where to breathe. Naruto, your stones. He already had a fistful of scrap cloth. He flicked them onto the new gray and felt the thin shade thicken a fraction as if a tired person had sat down. He stepped once, twice, 3 times on those dots, each the size of his hand, and got from the square to the alley mouth without the light catching him like a lie. Children first, he called. Not a shout, the kind of sentence that makes other people remember they have bodies to aim. Elderly next. If you can carry, you carry. If you can stand, you pass. We're going underground. Underground is flooded half the time. A fisherman snapped, panic pushing the rudeness out of him first. Lucky day, Naruto said. It's the other half. Hinata, here. She'd already vanished and reappear. Ed at the mouth of the alley with a charcoal-streaked map torn from someone's ledger. Cisterns under the bathhouse. Tunnels from the sake storehouses to the post road. There's a brick sewer under the old shrine that has silt it can swallow a child in. You're a delight, Naruto said, and meant it. Veil stood at her shoulder, small and faceless, sound rippling against her hands as if the echo were coaxing noise to tell the truth. Steps where the stones are uneven, Hinata added. The third is cracked. Good, Naruto said, and sent a pulse down his spine that the gate turned into clarity that traveled. On me, on each other. Follow the fans. He didn't have fans, not like Tamari. He had the way people do what they see other people doing as long as it looks possible. He ran first. He hit the top of the bathhouse steps, turned, scooped a crying toddler out of a man's uselessly wide hands, thrust the child into Sakura as she slid into the mess with bandages around her neck and an expri. Seijin that said don't die on my schedule, please, and then he ran again. The shadow ban array didn't like underground. It could make Noon look invincible out under the false sky, in the tunnels, where water had opinions and roots pushed the mortar aside with the patience of saints, the array sputtered. Hinata's voice made the sewers understandable. Veil reached in muffled panic sounds that would have become stampedes. Tamari laid wind along the corridor mouths like rails to keep smoke moving with them and not against. Tenten knelt in doorways and dropped a handful of something small and hard that rang when it hit stone. What are those? A dockworker panted, eyeing the caltrops in the dim light they might turn to rats. Borrowed stars, Tenten said, and left one pressed to the jam of a dew. Or where it drank the light like it had been hungry. The corner darkened from thread-thin to shade-sized. They'll hold for a while. She'd made them from night's edge scrap. Each little anchor was a seed of twilight. Naruto felt their little hums in his teeth like a harmony. He threw more cloth dots, cheap as confetti and twice as rude to the precious geometry of the lumen lattice. Karen stood under the shrine's cracked lintel and sang under her breath. It wasn't a song people write down. It was Uzumaki counter-chant, a braid of numbers and spite that tangled the pulse under the arrays. You're beating on the one too, Karen. Naruto called as he hauled a crate of medicine onto a boy's back and shoved him toward safety. Give me a crooked four. She grinned without humor, snapped her rhythm asymmetrical. The false sun's hum stumbled. The array's mirrors faltered a second in place. Shadows thickened just enough to make an alley look like itself again. 4, she said, with attitude. Marry me, Tamari muttered. Half sincere, and Karen barked a laugh, rolled her shoulder, kept breaking the math. On the bell tower, a blade sister of the tribunal watched them like a cat judges a table. She wore white and a brand at the throat that drank sunlight until it was almost pretty. Yugao climbed the tower in plain sight because subtlety is often a trick to make you feel clever about losing. No one noticed her until she stepped over the last rung and was there, a person-shaped argument against whatever plans the blade sister had enjoyed polishing. Leave, the blade sister said, not be. Othering with the kind of opening gambits that sound like conversation. Not today, Yugao said, and offered her a clean, ordinary guard. The blade sister went high and showy. Yugao went small and mean. Their blades found each other with the sound of rain on tin. The false sun found the tower with a lazy pulse of brightness, and the shadows between the bell's ribs shrank to the width of a finger. Yugao adjusted where she put her feet and turned the fight a quarter degree toward safety for the people below. It was little. It was enough. Out in the light, Naruto learned how much a body can sweat under a sky that hates it. He lifted. He shouted. He did the thing with the cloth dots. He stepped when stepping mattered and waited when it didn't, which was harder. A boy started to cry the way boys cry when they've learned how to keep the sound trapped in their teeth so adults won't tell them to hush. Naruto bent, picked him up, set him on a wooden pallet that 6 strangers immediately turned into a stretcher. The boy's mother tried to say thank you without sobbing and failed, then didn't apologize for failing, which felt like the bravest thing Naruto had seen all day. He let the call loose for the first time. Not much. Not the thing with the river's door thrown wide. Just a pulse that said, move like this. People heard the tune and tuned their hands to it. A thin line of elders felt themselves lifted. Shoulders under shoulders, a granddad going hand to hand like a jar of plums at harvest. The passage from the cannery to the shrine became the corridor of hands. Naruto didn't watch them praise him. He watched them become braver, which felt like a different word entirely. Later he'd come back and learn names. Now he made sure the tune stayed simple enough for anyone to sing. Corridor holding, Hinata reported. Voice from everywhere, as if the tunnels had learned to speak because she had the right to ask. Second group. Wait, the old kiln collapsed last winter. We need another route. Make it, Naruto said. I'll have to break a wall. Then break it. She did. The crack of her palm on ancient brick rolled through the sewer like thunder walking. Water sluiced into a lower channel with a happy, wet roar. The second group shoved forward, whooping like men crossing a flooded street with the knowledge that somebody had made it passable. Naruto pressed his back to a post and let himself breathe once. That breath almost caught fire. The Archon stepped into the corridor mouth like an answer written before a question is asked. He didn't bring the ceremony of the tower. No choir of false bells, no parade. His presence bent the air. The brand on his wrist shone like polished bone. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need to. The light got heavier on the floor, oppressive. In the way duty gets heavy when you ignore it long enough. Your door keeps people alive, the Archon said. He had a right to be bored. He wasn't. His attention fell on Naruto the way a blade does when it's testing a whetstone. I'm impressed. Buy me lunch, Naruto said. He stood as if he were in a doorway he owned, because he was. The Archon lifted his hand. The false sun hummed a thick note. Naruto's feet left the ground with ugly grace, hauled by a beam that wasn't a beam so much as a suggestion enforced at volume. The Archon's fingers closed on Naruto's throat, not hard, not dramatic. Possessive. He tilted Naruto's head to make eye contact like someone adjusting a painting on a wall. You are a cage, the Archon said. You cannot help it. Let me make you a lock. Something in Naruto slotted into place at the sound of that voice and wanted to agree because agreeing promised less pain. He found the part of himself that was 13 and had decided the world did not get to decide. He reached for the gate. He found that it was already open in a way he didn't like. The brand on the Archon's wrist pulsed. The light in it tasted like a command that had never learned how to be a request. He could bind him now. The part of him that wanted to end this whispered. He could reach under the Archon's shadow. It was there, thin, honest, grab the echo by the scruff and slam it into kneeling. It would end a lot of nights. It would also prove the Archon right. Naruto's palm lifted. He felt the tug answer, eager. No, Hinata said. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't scolding. She wasn't even in the corridor mouth. She stood a dozen paces back, shoulders braced, Byakugan blazing, water lines of the sewers bright in her gaze like a map of patience. Her voice carried because he had tuned himself to it. We aren't that. The word hit him like a hand on a shoulder when you're about to hit somebody who deserves it and your friend doesn't let you ruin yourself that way. Naruto choked on a laugh. That was almost a sob and let the tug go slack. He did something else instead. He tilted his domain toward the brand, opened it exactly as wide as necessary, and invited the light in. It hurt. Not hot metal on skin hurt. Not even the glass underwater pane of the gate opening at the river. It was the hurt of swallowing a static charge and realizing your bones are conducting. The brand's light pour ed into the domain he held like someone appending a bowl of milk over a perfectly set tablecloth. The domain drank everything, too much, overflowing the edges of him, cracking his knees. The brand sputtered. The Archon's hand tightened involuntarily, then loosened when the light in the brand went out with a mean little sigh. Naruto hit the floor. He landed on his elbows and then his back because his legs had gone somewhere else for a minute. The world's edges fuzzed and then sharpened. He tasted blood and a note in the hum of the false sun that had shifted a half step toward curious. The Archon stared at his dead brand with genuine surprise. He lifted it like looking at the back of his own hand had just become interesting again. Then he laughed once, short, delighted, with a professional's admiration. Good, he said, good. A spear of daylight came hunting sideways through the alley to punish Naruto for being impressive. Glaive stepped between it and his body. There wasn't time for heroics or speeches. The lance wasn't a line, not really, it was a place where the idea of light had been made temporarily cruel. It met shadow and erased it. One heartbeat Glaive stood, weight steady, hair echo at his shoulder where it had always been. The next heartbeat there was a hole in the world shaped like what used to stand there. Naruto rolled onto a knee, grabbed the empty air with both hands. Stupid gesture. Human anyway. The deletion left the smell of rain when it hasn't rained and a memory of a man's stance. He bowed his head, quickly, as if someone had shouted orders. Thank you, he said, raw and simple. The corridor heard him. The people he had just shepherded heard him. The Archon heard him. The Archon tilted his head, thoughtful. Perhaps he had expected wailing. Perhaps he had expected rage. Gratitude was a poor fit in the model, so he tried to make a new model. Men like that always do. You'll learn, he said again, softly now, as if he could save his own breath by wanting it. Someone else is coming. A pressure approached from the bay, clean as a blade drawn out of scabbard without scratching the leather. The false sun over Kurohama brightened to a soft whine, N lowered itself toward the water as if it were a god curious about its reflection. The surface flattened against it like a sheet, then hardened. A kilometer of shoreline turned white. The sound was strange. The pop of steam trapped. Little sighs as sand learned to become glass. Children cried at the beauty because children cry at the wrong things when the world is wrong. Fishermen swore, articulate, helpless. Naruto dragged himself to his feet because you can do that, even when you can't. He stumbled once. Hinata's hand touched the center of his back and set him upright as if she had decided the word posture should apply to him. He nodded without looking at her. He walked toward the new shore where black had become white. The line between glass and sand gleamed, perfect as a border drawn by a tyrant. A shape formed beyond it. Wearing a body like a man wears a good suit to an execution, out of courtesy, out of a desire not to make a mess. Arata, Karen whispered, more feel than sight. Not fully. Not all the way. Avatar or facet. The human part of him rides it like a... She groped for a word and found one ugly enough, pilot fish. The Radiant Air's avatar stepped onto the glass and didn't leave a mark. He wasn't tall. He felt tall because gravity loved him. Armor wrapped him in plates like clear amber with a dull star caught in the chest as if the night had made a brooch and he had pinned it on to be funny. Light slid around him like well-trained dogs. He lifted his eyes and the false sun above the bay dimmed a fraction, deferential. People around Naruto were suddenly lent because silence is a survival trick you can't teach, bodies do it for you. Naruto, the air said, and it came out conversationally, like they'd met at a market and were both reaching for the same late peach. Arata, Naruto said, because names matter, and the air's mouth moved in a way that might once have been a smile for someone else. He pointed at the white glass line. Step across, and I end your night. Naruto stepped. The glass crackled under his heel, snow new, unready. He didn't draw. Tamari made a choked noise in her throat like laughter caught in a mask. Tenten shifted her eyed to keep Night's Edge ready without making it the point. Yugao stood with her blade low and the point angled down like a promise 1 degree from being kept. Hinata stood to Naruto's left in what a NY fool would call the worst place to be and felt right because she had decided it. 3 blows. The first was Arata's. Simple, almost lazy, a hook of light drawn tight and compact. Naruto met it with the flat of his forearm. Domain kissing light just enough to blur it, and slid inside the line to sink his knuckles into the soft place under the armor's floating ribs. He felt something human in there, and the something flinched. Not pain, surprise. He stored that away. The second was Naruto's, bold, a step through his own shadow and the reflection of Arata's ankle in the glass at once, that mirrored place he had learned to trust. He came up at Arata's back and would have taken the star plate from the front with a hard grip but for the way the armor rotated on a physics he didn't enjoy. Arata let the plate spin, caught it, pushed Naruto's hands off with the gravity of a planet. Naruto went, because men do when planets ask. The third should have been finishing. It wasn't. Arata raised his hand, and the false sun lowered in sympathy, and Naruto knew he didn't have enough domain left after eating the Archon's brand to be clever. He didn't have to. Temari's wind slapped the motion sideways. Without aiming to win. just to miss precisely. Tenten's anchor stars hummed along the customs house and drank enough glare to create a seam. Hinata tapped the ground once with the ball of her foot and called, under her breath, "There." Naruto stepped where she had told him to discover his heel had a friend. Light and shadow tangled without fanfare. White glass cracked in a sketch of a crescent around Arata's boots. He didn't stumble. He looked down and then up. Slow, like enjoyably difficult homework had just gotten more fun. "Good," he said, genuinely, warmly. It would have been flattering if it weren't about his intent to murder a city. "I want the real you. You've gotten enough of me today," Naruto said. Arata tilted his head, not in agreement, not in question. "Not human, but making an effort for the rung. Grow," he said again, almost tender. "Bring me the boy who opened the black gate the day he understood why he did it." Naruto's mouth wanted to be unkind. He strangled that "I am" pulse because unkindness would have been cheap and true and too easy to come back from. "Bring me the god when he remembers he started human," he said instead. There was no blow to follow. Arata glanced once around the bay as if choosing a wall color and then let the avatar collapse into a coin-bright seed of light that zipped to Naruto's shoulder and took up orbit like a tame moon. It hummed. It bled nothing. It refused to be touched. Everyone took a step back except Hinata. "What is that?" Tenten said carefully, like asking if a stain would come out. "A timer," Karen said, grim. "A dare. AWR to make sure doors open at a certain hour and not before. If he comes close to death, it will go off. If he chooses not to grow, it will go off. If he grows wrong." She didn't finish, because Uzumaki superstition leaks out of the facts even when you hold them by the neck. Naruto kept his face neutral. His stomach felt like a city street after the carts have gone home and there's a walnut left on the stones for someone to step on and turn an ankle. "We're done talking in the open," he said, and the call went with it, the same line of tune that had kept people from becoming a stampede bikami. "In the order that gets you from a battlefield to a bakery in one piece." The evacuation wasn't over just because somebody had made a dramatic declaration. A woman with her hair in a scarf walked up to Naruto and put a dead baby in his arms because grief makes you practical when you can't afford to be anything else. He took the weight, not gentler than you should, not rough either, just correctly. He handed the tiny body to a man with a steady mouth. "Carry her for her mother," he said, and the man did, sobbing like a kettle set on fire. Sakura made a command post in the shade of a cart Tenten had bullied into making. She had people lie down where light couldn't find their faces as easily, not for comfort so much as for the trick it plays on panic when the body discovers it has a ceiling. Ino counted breaths out loud, slow and stupid, and the minds around her clung to the numbers like nails. At the bell tower, Yugao parried a thrust she would have let stand to teach a lesson any other dog. Why and cut the Blade Sisters brand off the woman's neck in a clean arc. The skin sealed itself with light like hot glass dragged back into shape by an artist who didn't know how to stop trying. The Blade sister looked at the knife as if it had become an opinion she respected and sat down, legs folded, and watched their people pass with eyes like a report she would write later when she wasn't busy becoming real. Naruto walked along the corridor of hands with the second son at his shoulder humming like a wasp and didn't try to bat it away. He told a man to stop trying to pick up 3 sacks and pick up 1 person. He told a boy to carry water to the little kids and not to feel stupid about being small. He told the gate guard of Kurohama to write numbers on his palm and add them until the mess made sense. He told the gate in his chest to stop trying to prove things for a minute and just do the job. It listened. It always listened when he managed to tell it what he meant. He almost fell on the far side of the old shrine. Hinata was there again without fanfare, one hand at his elbow, the other flat on his ribs where the brand had burned him last night. She didn't speak. He breathed through her palm until the false sun's hum and the air's token at his shoulder fell out of sync and the inside of him quit rattling like cheap hardware on a good door. All day the city moved like gears he hadn't drawn but had somehow learned to turn. By dusk, what passed for dusk under the counterfeit, Kurohama had fewer people above ground than a proper city should. The bell tower stood without its bell, cut free to use as a sled to carry someone who had loved it. The white glass stripe across the shore looked like a healed wound that had never closed right. The false sun didn't leave, but it dimmed to a sickly halo, a bruise of light. More persistent than threatening. They took stock in the shell of the old shrine. The roof had a hole. Real sky peered in, sympathetic. Naruto sat on the step because he wanted his back to the world. Not because he couldn't stand. Temari's hair had plaster dust in it and she hadn't noticed. Tenten had smudges in a pattern that would have been artistic if it errant from touching too many hot things. Karen hummed to herself, counting numbers in little loops until her breathing matched. Yugao had a nick on her cheek that looked like she'd chosen it to keep. Hinata's hands shook once. She put them flat on her thighs and they stopped. Glaive, Naruto said, tasting the name. It held. You lost a soldier, Temari said evenly. Not a piece. Not a pet. A comrade. I know, he said. Act like it. Then, she said, not unkind. Stand him in the line. Thank him. Keep moving. He did stand. He did keep moving. Thanking felt like the opposite of moving, but Abe the line goes in a circle we don't see and the opposite is where you end up anyway. He bowed a fraction to the empty space where Glaive would have stood. He didn't make a speech. He let the quiet stand in the middle of them like a flag you don't lower. Karen's eyes had been on the air's orbiting seed for the last 10 minutes without blinking. There's a rhythm, she said, almost to herself. It's a line to a star you can't see yet. She shrugged. But I can. What do we do about it? Naruto asked. Nothing, she said, and when he stared she rolled a wrist, annoyed. Right now, nothing. If you poke a trap to prove you aren't afraid of it, you become proof that traps work. Later, I'll talk to the seal like it's a neighbor I need to borrow rice from. We'll walk right past it. Always wanted to be a pantry door. Naruto said. Humor ached. He let it anyway. Tenten finally slid Night's Edge back into the wrap she'd sewn from her own undershirt. The anchors held, she said. Some burned. I'll make more. Her voice softened. You held, too. Barely, he said. That counts, she said. Blacksmith wisdom. Yugao leaned her shoulder against the shrine's cracked pillar, eyes on the line of white along the shore. You overextended without flinching, she said. Don't make a habit of being brave in the way that kills the best things you have. He opened his mouth to say something. Cocky and shut it because her voice had not moved an inch but the air around it had. Yes, he said, simple. Teach me the right cuts. I'll make them. Good, she said, the way a teacher says good wh. And a student hasn't learned the thing yet but has stopped pretending they already did. Hinata picked a bit of glass out of his hair like the intimacy of a wife 20 years late to everyone but them. You almost, she said. And he knew what she meant. I didn't, he said, and she nodded once. Thank you. Temari flicked plaster off her shoulder and snorted. We aren't done, she said. The Tribuna, L's going to come looking for the pieces they lost. The heir's going to write poetry about you and then try harder. And we have a garden gnome of murder orbiting you like a ring. It's more of a bad moon, Tenten offered. This is when I'm supposed to be worried, Naruto said, and lifted the canteen to drink. He was shaking too hard to be smooth and didn't care. I am worried, but I'm also here, and alive, Sakura said from the doorway, hair matted, eyes hot and clear with the leftover adrenaline of saving someone clever enough to get themselves killed and humble enough to let her stop it. Don't forget that part when you go invent heroism. I'll put it on the to-do, he said, and he wasn't joking. Night crept around the edges of the false sun like a smart thief, slow enough not to trip alarms. The second sky refused to do what the first one did and kept trying to be important. People crawled out of the tunnel mouths into corners Naruto refused to call shelters because the word made you smaller than you needed to be. Campfires were outlawed by the array's temper. Tea tasted like a rumor in cold cups. Children fell asleep because children can when no one else can afford to. Men shivered and didn't say it out loud. Naruto walked among them and didn't say anything either. He had nothing useful to offer except the sentence that had gotten them this far. He used it on me. The tune came again, small and humane. It didn't ask anyone to worship him. It asked them to be brave about their own hands. He stopped by a stack of fish crates where an old woman had set 3 sticks as if thinking of making a little house for a child. She had a scar that told a story he would never hear. She stared up at the second sun and spat once. Dainty. Looks cheap, she said. He loved her with all the easy, stupid heat he kept for people who say the right disrespect at the right time. It does, he said gravely. Go on then, she said, waving him away. You've got important pretending to do. He went on. He stopped by the bell tower and looked up. Yugao was a line of night against the bright. She was not staring at the second sun. She was watching the places where it failed. He tried to memorize that posture. He turned and found Tamari perched on a barrel like a cat with courtly manners, counting breath for breath with Karen until they found a way to agree on a future they would ruin and rebuild for practice. Tenten slept with her hand on the wrap where Night's Edge lay like a question. Hinata stood in the shadow that the shrine insisted on making in defiance of the array, eyes half closed. Counting lives like prayer beads. He wanted to talk about Glaive then. He didn't. He didn't know what to say yet. That wasn't a benediction he was unequipped to give. He said it to the hollow spot inside him the echo had left. Thank you. I'll do better. The seed of noon at his shoulder hummed once in a tone that made the hair on his arms rise and then settled into its mean little orb. It like a thing that believed itself inevitable. He didn't touch it. He did a stupid little half-turn without thinking to see if it cast a shadow and hated himself for it before he relaxed because Ada's hand found his and squeezed as if to say, you are not alone in your stupid movements, I see them. They are mine, too. Tomorrow, she asked. Tomorrow, he said. Let me see the path first, she said. You can step after. He looked his fill at the face she wore when she let herself be tired in front of him and felt something in him answer in a way that had nothing to do with the gate. Deal. They slept in layers. He and the seed of noon and the dome of borrowed shadow that Tenten's anchors made and the false sun and the real stars scratching around the edges like mice. His dreams were all doors. He opened each one. Behind some were rooms full of names. Behind one the river was waiting with its hands open. He woke to the smell of a fire built wrong and the sound of a child laughing at someone falling down gently on purpose. The false sun hadn't moved. The seed hadn't either, but there was a notch cut in the hum, a little weakness where Karen had found a place to put her fingernail. He grinned. Bare and terrible and real. Good morning, he told the cheap counterfeit. We'll take it from here. The war hadn't ended. It had just learned their names. Chapter 4 End. Chapter 5. A crown cast by its own light. Training happens in the ugly hours between crisis and news. It smells like old tea, chalk dust, sweat, and a stubborn belief that you can make tomorrow different if you bleed for it the right way. Yugao drew a line in the dojo's plank floor with the point of a practice blade and told Naruto to cut it in half without touching the wood. No genjutsu, no drama, just precision. Light is lazy, she said, setting a lantern on the floor so the glow slid across the line. It takes the big roads. Cut the road. He pulled his domain to the size of a breath and set it where lantern and shadow shook hands. Night's Edge lay on a cloth at the end of the room like a sleeping truth. He didn't touch it. He lifted 2 fingers and pulled. The glow kinked. The line on the board went. T2 directions for a heartbeat and then chose one. The lantern guttered. Yugao's mouth warmed by half a degree. Again. He did it until his eyes throbbed. Once he overreached and the lantern went out with an offended sigh. She relit it without commentary and tapped the blades flat against his ribs where the Archon's brand had burned. Right cuts, she said. Or you will spend your courage like a gambler who thinks the cards owe him. Quote. Later, in the wind-scoured practice yard, Tamari tied a length of ribbon to a stick and made him chase the shadow it cast across the sand as she swung it. You like to be clever, she said. Bored and fond at once. The ribbon flashed, the shadow skittered. Clever is fine. Wind is better. Learn to listen to what the air is going to do before it does it. He lunged when the ribbon snapped left and was there before its shade landed. Temari's brows went up. She snapped right. He beat it again. She grinned, sharp and pleased. Attaboy. In Tenten's corner of the yard, the anchors were being born. She shaved Night's Edge scrap into thin crescents that hummed like bees. Each she pressed into a clay seal she'd carved by lamplight. Not just hucking darkness like confetti anymore, she said, sliding one onto a cord and tossing it to him. It hung in his palm like a small valiant moon. These will stick to anything that thinks it's a wall. Don't waste them. Karen paced the perimeter, eyes half-lidded, counting a pattern none of them could hear. When she stopped, she had ink on her fingers and a handful of paper seals that smelled like ocean salt and stubborn ideas. "This is a bad handshake," she said, matter of fact. "If the air tries to split, this will make him introduce himself to himself first." One body, one conversation. Hinata didn't talk much. She walked Konoha's streets at dawn and memorized how the light came around corners and over eaves when the second sun was high. She took notes like a cartographer of radiance, angles, heights, where laundry lines made mercy. In the evenings she led Naruto onto rooftops and had him step from one narrow wedge of dusk to another with his eyes closed while she called bearings in a voice like the softest command. He never tripped where she told him to go. "Again," she would say, when he nailed it. "Bossy," he murmured, not hiding his gratitude. "Efficient," she corrected, and he loved her eye. "And the way that does not stop your feet moving." When they were tired enough to talk without self-consciousness, they lay on their backs on the Hokage monument and watched the counterfeit sun hang like a coin someone forgot to put away. The seed at Naruto's shoulder hummed its mean little orbit, sometimes louder, sometimes not. Karen sat cross-legged, listening with her eyes closed, lips moving around numbers. "There," she said finally, tapping a beat into Naruto's bicep. "It flubs on the fifth count every 6 minutes. Not much. Enough to break a rhythm if you're rude about it." "I am extremely rude," Naruto said. "Ask anyone." "Consider it asked," Tamari said from his other side. "Consider it answered." The plan never came out in one piece on a table. It arrived in gestures, in the way hands moved while people pretended not to be afraid, in the click of Yugao's scabbard against the doorframe when she left the room last because nobody should leave alone. When they said Hollow City, what they meant was the old capital where nobody lived anymore because the river moved and the merchants did too. Buildings jammed together there like teeth. Alleys wove. The squares were too small to be proud, the roofs liked to kiss. At noon it was a web of edges. At fake noon it would be a labyrinth if you lit it right. Tamari climbed to the highest roofs at dawn with 4 sand boys who looked at her like she was a legend and she made them laugh until the fear was usable. She threw kites into the upper air, mirror-bellied, tail-feathered, each tethered to a spool she could play like an instrument. They hung in the blue like indifferent birds, catching and throwing like the way gossip moves in a small town. Tenten hid anchors in doorframes and under lintels and on the backs of saints in old shrines, murmuring apology and promise. Hinata walked the alleys and nodded and once bent and pressed her palm to the base of a statue so time would remember where to offer mercy later. Karen smudged a seal into a threshold that had never seen a king and rolled her shoulders as if shedding a cloak. Yugao sharpened the moment. Naruto stood on a roof tile that had cracked and been mortared back by a hand that loved this city when it mattered. He looked down on the crowded stiffness of Hollow City and let his breath settle into a tune his bones knew now. The seed of noon at his shoulder hummed. He did not touch it. He bent and pressed the heel of his palm to the tile and said thank you to a stranger who had fixed something before him. The Lumen Tribunal arrived at noon because of course they did. Wardens with mirror sleeves. Sun priests with brands like jewelry. The sevenfold archon in the middle, brandless now, a curiosity left standing upright after Naruto had shattered the leash. He walked with a new economy. Less religion, more thought. And then Arata Otsutsuki came. Not in a column of light. Not with heralds. He stepped into Hollow City's first square as if he had misplaced Summit. Hingen would like to be done with finding it. The armor that wasn't quite armor glowed soft along a dozen lines. The star caught in his chestplate pulsed like a heartbeat trying to be regular. The Alcee sun above the city dimmed and brightened in time with him, the way breath follows run. He looked up once at the mirror kites and smiled faintly, almost embarrassed for them. Children, he said to his wardens, no contempt there. Just annoyance at the untidy tenderness of men. Fetch. Tamari twitched a wrist. Kites rolled. The light began to misbehave on purpose. Now, Karen said, and slapped her seal into the air as if it were a mouth deciding to tell the truth. The lines rippled across the square like heat over stone. The wardens moved to split and surround, to create the circle trick T. Had worked on villages that believed the noon was real. The seal hit the shape of Arata's presence and forced it inward the way a jar forces pollen to become honey. He frowned. He had not forgotten how to frown like a human. Sing, Naruto said. Hollow City sang. It was not pretty. It was not soldier's chorus or ancient hymn. It was 100 throats taking the tune he set with the call and turning it into steps. It cost them chakra. It cost them the fear of looking foolish. For one heartbeat, their shadows rose. Doubles pulled free like breath on a cold day. They did not think. They moved. Where the line of bodies needed them to. To lift a beam, to strike, to catch someone falling. The shadow choir spoke in motion. Arata stepped toward Naruto and met two Naruto for the space of a blink. One shadow, one boy. The echo broke as designed. The real one stayed and grinned like a man about to run somewhere heroic and stupid. If you want the real me, he said, earn it. The air heated. So, Lar edict happens where a god decides noon should fall and refuses to be argued with. Tamari twisted wind into corridors. The light hit wind and became line. Tenten's anchors caught the lines and made them think they had run into something worth stopping for. Yugao stepped into a gap that was going to hurt and did not get hurt because she knew how not to be there when pain arrived. Hinata's voice slid through the noise, calling the single path that did not end in cruelties. Karen counted. 5, soft and sure, and the seed of noon at Naruto's shoulder flubbed its beat as promised. The radiant air dropped to sunfall. It looked like gentleness if you didn't know the shape of heat. Light poured like milk from a broken pitcher. Roofs hissed. Stone took a breath it could not finish. Naruto was already moving, part stubborn and part instruction. He pulled his domain wide enough to taste fire, then a little wider because Hinata's palm on his spine said, "Do not make me stand alone." The world went twilight for 3 heartbeats. The sunfall met a room that didn't want it and spread thin like a curtain on a bad rod. It cracked him. He felt his knees go bright. Hinata was there, not in front of him, not a shield, beside him. Her chakra climbed into his domain and did not try to be him. It asked. It fit. His twilight steadied. The sunfall dimmed enough that 2 men in the alley behind them did not die for somebody else's story. Arata watched, interested. Better, he said. He shifted left without moving his feet. The armor rotated on him like a decision he had made weeks ago. Tenten Bli. Nked sweat out of her eyes and hurled 3 anchors. They struck the plates and stuck with little polite clinks. Light puddled on them, unhappy and useful. Yugao cut lines. She did not stab. Almost not. Hing in this fight cared about being stabbed. She drew precise slashes in the seams where Arata's not armor breathed to keep him from boiling his own human. Each line she drew made the air admit a new physics. Tamari felt it and ran wind along it as if along a rail. Karen hissed, "Now," and Naruto stepped. He did not step out of Arata's shadow. He stepped out of his friend's. Temari's shadow is longer than she thinks. Because wind throws it and forgets to take it back. Tenten's is tidy and honest, so the step comes true with a very satisfying click. Hinata's is soft and full and knows the way. Yugao's is a blade laid on cloth. You do not bleed, but you acknowledge it. Naruto moved from each to the next like a man striding across a flood on the backs of stones someone set when they loved the river. He came out at Arata's heart. Night's Edge sang when it cleared the rap. Not loud, proud. He did not swing it like a hero in a mural. He placed it like a craftsman lays a straight edge to trim a board to fit the room. The blade met the starplate's seam and drank light for a heartbeat. The room tried to be normal. The star's pulse thinned. Arata's hand closed on the blade out of old reflex. It cut him. He looked at the blood with surprise and then with something else that had no word anymore in his language. Naruto felt the gate lean forward in him like a dog that wants to run and is waiting for you to say yes. Bind him. That wild part urged. End it. Naruto remembered the mercenary captain's flicker. The Odo woman who had chosen to keep fighting. Glaive's weight, and the hole where it was not now. Vale's small hands tasting sound. He remembered Hinata's. We aren't that, and the way his chest had stopped hurting for a second when he obeyed. He let the urge grow into a choice and then picked a different one. He lifted Night's Edge off the seam before it could make a prison. He slid the blade sideways and down, not cutting body, not cutting light, cutting contract. The problem wasn't Arata's armor or his star. It was the law written into his brand that said be a god like this or not at all. Naruto could see it now. Karen's seal had made the lines visible at a certain angle. A circle around a wrist. An old signature forced to repeat itself. He placed the edge and pressed, gentle and implacable as an apology that arrives on time. The brand screamed. Light tried to T out and could not decide which door existence would let it use. It poured toward Arata's shoulder and found Karen's counter-chant. It tried to run down his spine and hit Yugao's cut lying across a seam like a no. It tried to explode outward and met Temari's wind tunnel, which is what you do to a tantrum when you don't want it to wreck the kitchen. It raised heat to punish a boy for presuming and hit Tenten's anchors, which drank until they shook in her hands. Hinata pressed her palm to Naruto's back. He felt her breathe and matched it like you do when you are helping someone lift a sofa and you don't want to crush their fingers. The brand's light came at him. He opened his domain and did not take it. He let it pass through to ground. The ground took it greedily because Earth loves any story you spill into it. It will grow weeds out of it later if you let it. Arata made a soft sound. It could have been surprise. It could have been a man remembering what his own breath felt like. The star in his chestplate dimmed. The false sun above Hollow City flickered. Somewhere on the bell tower a warden stopped in the motion of stabbing a boy with a broken bottle because killing suddenly felt like paperwork he would have to file later, and he did not want to attend that meeting. Naruto had 1 second to decide whether he had done the right thing. In that second the seed of noon at his shoulder screamed like a kettle boiling dry. Down. Karen shouted, not because she needed to, not because there was time, because shouting is a love language for people who cannot reach your body in time to move it. The seed left its orbit. It came for his face. He could have stepped. He has never been bad at stepping. He didn't. He swung Knight's Edge up to meet it and placed the flat against the sea. D like a hand on the chest of someone about to blurt a secret that will ruin dinner. The blade's hum went low. The seed's scream staggered as if surprised to be met with anything other than heroic dodging. Naruto exhaled and said, very quietly, we're done. The seed hit the blade. It bled light like a cut jewel and split, not into shards, but into threads, tidy and obedient. The threads wanted to sew themselves into him. He did not let them. He lifted the blade another inch, just enough to direct them outward. They caught on the edges of the world where people had placed their shadows by standing where they had to stand, and made a ring in the air around him like a crown that hadn't decided who deserved it. The crown paused. It needed a law to obey. Naruto gave it one. He didn't do it with seals or a speech. He did it with Sovereign's Call, which isn't volume, it's one sentence exactly right, exactly once. We hold each other, he said. The crown spun once and fell. Not on Naruto, not on Arata, but on the circle of people standing inside this fight. It crowned the corridor of hands. It hung over Hinata like a small moon and over Temari's fan and over Tenten's anchors and over Karen's stubborn ink and over Yugao's quiet and over the heads of civilians with their mouths set to a line and their palms out. It sank into the streetlight and into the alleys and into the old saint's eyes. It woke dust on windowsills. It went into people, because that is where good crowns live. The brand tore. Not Naruto's, Arata's. The law broke without blood. The human man inside the armor came forward like a swimmer breaking surface. He staggered. He would have fallen. He chose instead to burn himself to ash, which is a tidy choice for a god raised on unkind rules. No, Naruto said, and this time the call was a shout, not in volume. In reach. He did not tell Arata to kneel or to live. He told everyone else to move. Shadows rose and did not kill. They shielded. The shadow choir became a wall between the sun and the man who had once called it himself. Civilian silhouettes, shinobi doubles, the quick shape of Veil with her hands tasting sound and deciding when to thicken silence. They took the heat, the blast. The dead end cried, and they made shade with it. Hinata closed her eyes and held. Temari leaned into the wind she had built like a sailor knowing the boat will not betray her. Tenten's anchors sang. Yugao's blade rested, tipped down, in the seam she had cut, which the light could not cross because she had said not here. The blast washed past and undid itself in the alleys and open windows and gone rooms of Hollow City. When the glare thinned, Arata remained. He looked. young. Not in body, in posture, in the way you look at somebody when you have met yourself honestly and survived it only by accident. He blinked at Naruto the way a man blinks when the sun has come out after a funeral. What have you done? He asked, in the flat tone people use when they are not asking for a study, just a word to anchor on. Made you smaller, Naruto said. It's the only way to make you fit in a world. Urata's mouth twitched. His eyes tipped toward the empty place where a brand should have still been and wasn't. His hand raked the air once, not a gesture meant for others, just a check. He found his chest. He felt the star. He nodded. He did not smile. Responsibility, he said, as if tasting a word and not finding it bitter for the first time. Hateful. Human, Naruto said. Worse, Urata said, and exhaled a laugh without humor. He looked beyond Naruto at the wardens who had begun to stand like men in a place where their bosses forgot to tell them what to do, and then at the sevenfold archon, who had watched the brand go and had not moved because a person without a god needs a minute. Urata lifted one hand in a shape that used to command and now looked like an offer. Stand down, he said. Some lowered weapons as if their arms had been heavy for a decade and Somio. Ne had finally asked them if they were tired. Some ran. One man knelt, brandless throat naked, hands on his knees, and looked at the ground as if he had met a god and found a boy and didn't know which to be more frightened of. Naruto could have collapsed just to have a reason to look at the sky and not at all the faces. He did not. He stood with his legs correct and his back right and knight's edge comfortable in his hand and waited. Because sometimes the bravest thing is letting the silence tell the room what story it is in now. Vale moved to his side. She tilted her head in a small bow, half playful, half military. He felt the gate in him lift, ready to keep her, greedy in the way a hearth likes wood. He opened his hand instead. Thank you, he told the echo. If you want to go, go. Vale pressed her sound-tasting hands together as if clapping without force. The air rippled. She looked up at Hinata, then at the woman's body they had laid where the stars had had teeth that night, and N. This is how he knew the rightness was clean. She looked at herself and nodded. She thinned like breath on glass leaving for a colder place. She was gone. He bowed his head and it wasn't a show. The people around him breathed that little easier breath you breathe when you see a man with power let a thing leave because it is not his to keep. Hollow City's broken noon began to fail on its own. Without the brand commanding geometry to be wicked, the fake sun drifted stupidly. Karen flicked her seal twice, neat as turning a page, and it went out like a candle you don't blow on because you are not 9 anymore. Urata looked at the place in the sky where that wrong circle had hung. I will be blamed for not being a miracle, he said, as if confessing to a crime. Then be a man instead, Yugao said. So dry the syllables were almost smoke. It will be harder. It will also be interesting. He made a face that might have been a smile years ago for someone else. He looked at Naruto and could not hide. Which was a kind of respect even gods can learn. If I stand with you, I will be betraying what made me. If you stand down, you'll be betraying people who had no hand in making you, Naruto said. Pick the betrayal that leaves you able to breathe. Urata nodded once like accepting a sword and stepped back. He didn't swear an oath. No one asked him to. It might have ruined everything. The sevenfold archon came forward. One finger resting along the ridge of his jaw. Without the brand he was not smaller. He was only truer. Your gate, he said softly to Naruto, the way a mathematician speaks to a proof he has finally understood. It is a door, not to a cage, to a room. He bowed. No sarcasm, nothing but the precise degree of neck that admits your logic failed. I will write a new sermon. Make it shorter, Tamari advised. People have things to do. He almost smiled. I will try. The hard part of any war is stopping. People kept running out of habit. They kept shouting from leftover adrenaline. Naruto let the call out one more time in that small humane way that isn't magic so much as sentence. We are done for now, he said. We are going home. They went. Not in a parade. In little knots, in trios. Some stayed to sweep glass. Tenten closed the wrap around Knight's edge and kissed the cloth with the same exact no-fuss delicacy she gives a tool that saved lives. Karen stood, where the seed had split and squinted at the scuff in the air like a stain she could get out. Give me a day, she muttered, mostly to herself. I'll launder the sky. Invoice in attitude, Tamari said, impossible not to grin at. Hinata touched Naruto's elbow. It wasn't a pull, it was a suggestion. He followed her out of the square and into a narrow street where laundry lines still hung because Light had opinions but grandmothers have more. She stopped by a door whose paint had flaked in a pattern like a map and looked at him like she was checking a wound she knew he had been ignoring. You did not bind him, she said. I wanted to, he said. Then I didn't. Her smile was small and beautiful and not a reward. Good. She hesitated, then did not hesitate. She stepped close enough that the breath of the world simplified and the noise became an honest hum. When you step, she said, I see where you're going. He let his head lean forward until their foreheads touched like two people checking a plumb line. Come with me, always, she said, and her hand found his like it had been looking for it this whole time and was done with the hunt. Konoha looked like a place Winning learned to love by the time they limped back. The false sun's bruise had faded from the sky. In the restaurants, somebody had oversalted the broth from trembling hands and nobody complained. Runners slept on their feet in doorways and were carried to cots without shame. Children played a game they made up on the road where the point was to stand on someone else's shadow and say, got you, and then the other kid says, you can't keep me. And runs. Tenten hung a little sign over a rebuilt forge with a roof that always had a stripe of twilight at noon because anchors in the beams hummed polite warnings to glare. The sign said, Edge an apology. Because I won't make one without the other, she told Naruto, handing him a cup of tea and a look that dared him to disagree. He did not. Karen painted a placard D on a narrow shopfront across from the river that had nearly killed him. Seals fixed. Names returned. People lined up for the second more than the first. Tamari left a feathered fan on Naruto's step, with a note that read, for when you forget the wind's part in this, don't. No signature. It didn't need one. Yugao handed in her report on Hollow City. It was 10 lines long. The Hokage read it twice, then a third time, frowning because the paper did not allow for the word feeling, and yet here they were. After, she found Naruto behind the tower where the stone keeps rain in it even when it isn't raining and said, you cut the right line. He didn't know how to thank her for being the exact blade she had been and for lending that shape to him. He said, teach me the next one. I will, she said, and then, very deliberately, rest. He tried. He sat with Kakashi on that bridge Tazuna built where this had started. They watched a boy Naruto had once pulled from a shadow throw rocks into the shallows and count the ripples. Kakashi's visible eye made its little crescent. You put a crown on the wrong people, he said, tone absent-minded to disguise the respect. On purpose, Naruto said. Good, Kakashi said, as if that settled it. At night, when he couldn't help it, Naruto went to the old shrine on the edge of town and stood where two lines met that nobody had bothered to mark. He said Glaive's name into the dark. He said Veil's and the Odo woman's who had chosen to keep fighting and the mercenary captains, quiet as a confession that kept not being a sin because he would not let it. The names did not echo. They didn't need to. He wasn't speaking for sound. He was speaking for weight. He thought of the crown that had almost taken his head and had fallen instead on everyone who deserved it for one shining minute. He thought of the way it had been made of threads of noon that had no idea what to do with themselves until someone told them a decent sentence. We hold each other. People tried to make him tell the story of what it felt like when he cut the brand that made a man into a machine. He held up his hands and said nothing, and sometimes he smiled, and sometimes he didn't. Hinata learned to touch his ribs when he didn't, exactly where the old burn had been, and the world went quiet. Not a god, he told a child who asked him, eyes big and sure and annoying. A doorman. What's that? The boy demanded, suspicious of any job that sounded like it had less glory than a title with armor attached. Someone who keeps good doors open and bad ones shut, Naruto said, The boy considered this and then decided it was possibly the best thing to be, if the snacks were good. The tribunal didn't vanish. The world never pays everything off at once. The Archon wrote shorter sermons. Some wardens broke their mirrors and set the shards into tabletops and lived with the fear of what that shape looked like in their houses. Urata did not become a hero. He became a person. who sometimes stood on rooftops and looked at the sky with his jaw set, and who once, in a market, reached out and stopped a jar from falling and looked baffled by his own hand. On a morning when the sky was unremarkable and children were late for school because they were fighting over who got to be the shadow and who the catcher, Naruto and Hinata walked down a street that had survived an idea. ND bought steamed buns from a vendor who had survived too. The woman put an extra in the bag and said, "For luck," and then, eyeing them both, "For patience," and Hinata laughed and the laugh went int. Oh, the paper bag and made the steam smell like something you could live in. They passed under a laundry line. Naruto touched his fingers to the thin shade it cast and felt it answer without hurry, like a cat who knows its name and will come in when it is good and ready. He did not need it to. He had his own step, his own breath, his own rule he'd carved with night's edge with everyone he loved laid behind him like stones in a river. He had his crown, brought down where it belonged. It did not sit on his head. It hung, invisible, above a city that had learned to be kind to itself when noon got out of hand. The river under the bridge ran as it always has, pretending it isn't the same water and being wrong and right about that, both at once. The door under it stayed shut because boys don't get to pull on it every time they want to be dramatic. When it opened again someday, he decided, it would be because someone needed a room where their choice had room to stand. He would be there, palm ready, blade sheathed, spine sure. "Home?" Hinata asked. "Home," he said. They turned into the street where shadows were ordinary and precious and the light knew, finally, to mind its manners. Chapter 5 End.